If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description. Additionally, if you would like to request novels and access my Google Drive where I have 200 plus audiobooks, then you can join my Patreon. Link is also provided in the description.
Chapter 41 The Advantage of Being in a Cheat Mode. Yvonne, do you know the essential difference between magical creatures and wizards? Yvonne thought for a moment and replied, well, magical creatures can be used as materials for alchemy and potions. But wizards, no matter if it's their blood, hair, or bones, are no different from muggles. Yes, wizards and muggles are fundamentally the same. This wasn't the kind of statement one would hear in the wizarding world, and Dumbledore wouldn't make such comments in public. However, in this private conversation, he felt comfortable sharing it, knowing Yvonne likely understood it as well. Yvonne nodded but was still puzzled. But wizards have magic, while muggles don't. The key difference isn't simply having magic, but rather, understanding magic, Dumbledore said, giving Yvonne a knowing smile. Understanding magic. Yvonne was still perplexed. Yes, Dumbledore continued. What do you think magic really is, Yvonne? What is it made of, and what form does it take? Yvonne paused, considering the question. In other fantasy worlds like Warcraft, Dungeons and Dragons, or similar realms, he might have said that magic is a form of energy or perhaps an elemental force that flows through the world, like an aura or mana. But this was Harry Potter, where magic didn't quite follow the same rules. Finally, Yvonne answered. It's indescribable. Magic is ethereal, Yvonne said thoughtfully. You can't see it or touch it, but wizards can channel it, turning it into power that allows them to make their wishes come true. Yes, invisible and immensely powerful, Dumbledore agreed. We can only witness the manifestations of magic, but we can't truly explore magic itself. This leads to a higher level of transfiguration beyond permanent transformation. Magical transformation. Magical transformation refers to the transformation of magical objects, or even living magical creatures. Wizards, however, are incapable of this. While wizards can transform metals, plants, and animals, they cannot transform magic itself. If the day ever comes when you, Yvonne, can transform a stone or even a mere ball of air into a fire-breathing dragon that can not only exist forever but also reproduce, you will no longer be considered a wizard. Instead, you would be called a god. Even Merlin, or the 4 founders of Hogwarts from 1,000 years ago, couldn't achieve such a feat. I understand, Yvonne nodded, taking Dumbledore's earlier warning to heart. I won't meddle with those dangerous powers until I receive your approval. Magical transformation essentially involves the creation of new materials and life, which is a divine realm. For now, Yvonne understood that it was enough to simply be aware of such a level of magic. Delving into it without proper understanding could result in irreversible damage too dangerous to pursue carelessly. Moreover, Yvonne still trusted Dumbledore. Outside of the complex plans surrounding Harry Potter, Dumbledore's character and wisdom were nearly impeccable. Yvonne didn't believe that, even with his system, he could just do whatever he wanted without caution. Thank you, Professor. It was getting late, so Yvonne bid Dumbledore good night before making his way back to the Gryffindor common room. The next morning, Gryffindor had charms class together with Ravenclaw. Their teacher, Professor Flitwick, had some goblin blood, which required him to stand on a stack of books to reach the top of his desk. Flitwick was incredibly approachable. As he called roll, he also took the time to chat with each student, quickly becoming familiar with all the young wizards. After that, Professor Flitwick began the day's lesson. He started by explaining some simple theoretical foundations of charms. Yvonne could tell that Flitwick was a very skilled teacher. Many complicated theories suddenly seemed easy to understand when he explained them. Throughout the entire lesson, Flitwick's clear and detailed explanations benefited Yvonne greatly. Many of his previous doubts were resolved during this class. In the middle of the lecture, Flitwick posed a few questions on basic charm theory. Hermione, with her quick responses, managed to outdo the Ravenclaw students and earn 3 house points for Gryffindor, which made the little witch incredibly happy. As expected of the charms professor at Hogwarts, Yvonne remarked to Hermione during the break. Professor Flitwick's mastery of spells is clearly top-notch. Yet. Hermione agreed enthusiastically, her eyes brimming with excitement and a thirst for knowledge. Yvonne. Neville, sitting on the other side of Yvonne, scratched his head. I didn't understand. Unlike the 2 academic wizards, Neville felt as if he had been listening to a foreign language during Flitwick's lecture. Actually, we're the same, Ronald admitted, and Harry nodded in agreement. The three of them hadn't understood much, not because Professor Flitwick wasn't clear, but simply because this style of teaching didn't suit them. How to put it? Some people excel at explanations, but when it comes to practical execution, they struggle. Harry, on the other hand, was a person of action. After observing for 2 days, Yvonne realized that Harry was the type who relied more on hands-on experience than theory. In short, Harry didn't need to hear complicated explanations. Just give him the spell and the wand, and his natural abilities would likely shine through and surprise everyone. As for Ronald and Neville, their situations were different. Ronald was more of an average student in the wizarding world. While he had potential, it was difficult to see him achieving extraordinary things in the future. Neville, on the other hand, had a talent that was in no way inferior to Harry's. The only problem with Neville was his lack of self-confidence. As is well known, magic in this world is deeply connected to one's thoughts, emotions, and willpower. In Ivan's understanding, thinking influenced how quickly one could learn spells, mind determined the strength of the magic, and willpower governed how well one could control it. Hermione has an exceptionally high thinking attribute, which allows her to grasp most spells instantly. However, due to her relatively low mental attribute, it's difficult for her to cast powerful spells, and this is her major shortcoming. Neville, on the other hand, is very slow. His thinking could almost be considered negative. So no matter how high his mental or willpower attributes might be, he struggles to learn spells initially. The first step is hard for Neville, but once he gets going, everything else will be much easier, Yvonne thought to himself. If Neville can master just one spell, his performance might rival Harry's. Harry, however, has an incredibly high mental attribute and an astonishingly strong willpower, but his thinking is another story entirely. Each attribute affects more than one aspect of magic. For instance, thinking includes factors like memory, calculation, analysis, and reaction speed. So, even if two people have the same level of thinking, their performance might differ depending on how the attribute is distributed. For Hermione, her thinking is distributed roughly 5:4:1 across these aspects. Her reaction speed is slightly above average but not extraordinary. Harry, on the other hand, has a severely unbalanced thinking attribute, with nearly all of it focused on reaction speed, an astonishing ratio of 1:1:8. In Ivan's terms, Harry is a natural-born combat wizard. In battle, it would take 3 Hermiones to even stand a chance against one Harry, even if Harry only knew how to cast a simple disarming charm. Of course, Ivan's system of point distribution focuses on maxing out all aspects of an attribute. Once he upgrades his thinking, all related aspects, memory, calculation, and reaction speed, will reach optimal levels. In terms of numbers, Ivan's data would be a balanced 10 hours 10 minutes and 10 seconds. Yes, Ivan's total isn't just 10, it's a full 30. The advantage of being in a cheat mode is obvious. Chapter 42, Giving the Charms Professor a Little Shock. Next, let's learn the first spell of the year, the lumos spell. Professor Flitwick said in his high-pitched but pleasant voice, which had a playful and endearing quality. When you recite the spell, make sure to pronounce it clearly. Follow me and say, lumos. After ensuring that the students from both Gryffindor and Ravenclaw were familiar with the incantation, Professor Flitwick let them practice freely. Lumos. For a while, the classroom echoed with the sounds of students repeating the spell. The lumos spell wasn't particularly difficult, and the self-suggestion required by the spell didn't pose much of a challenge for the young wizards. The main difficulty lay in controlling the right amount of magical power. Since many of the students had never used their wands to cast spells before, even with a clear goal, they struggled to make their wands light up. Your pronunciation is a bit off, Hermione said, correcting both Harry and Neville as they practiced, while Yvonne sat quietly, reflecting on the lumos spell and the issues he encountered while casting it. The magical knowledge Dumbledore had imparted to Yvonne was mostly theoretical, designed to provide a strong foundation for more advanced studies later on. This approach made sense after all. Dumbledore was the headmaster and focused on broader instruction. For specific subjects, there were designated professors responsible for teaching, and Dumbledore wouldn't take over their duties. Besides, he didn't have the time to handle everything. Ivan's current approach to learning was straightforward: study independently in the library, seek out the professors for help when encountering difficulties, and only consult Dumbledore when something truly perplexed him. "Oh, look, Miss Granger did it!" Professor Flitwick exclaimed as he noticed the light shining from the tip of Hermione's wand. He jumped up and down with excitement, enthusiastically praising the young witch's talent for spells. Gryffindor, 5 points, thanks to Miss Granger. In the first class, the first student to successfully cast a spell certainly deserved recognition. Soon after, several Ravenclaw students also managed to cast the Lumos spell. Given the spell's low difficulty, Yvonne mentally ranked it as the baseline, the simplest magic with a threshold that most first-year students could master quickly. Time ticked away, minute by minute. By Ivan's estimation, about 10 minutes remained in the class, and only 5 students had managed to successfully cast the spell. Most of them were Ravenclaws, with only Hermione and Harry succeeding among the Gryffindors thanks largely to Hermione's guidance and corrections. That seems about right, Yvonne thought. With just over 20 students in the class, a quarter of them succeeding wasn't too surprising. Lumos. 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 Bang. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion, and Ivan's calm expression turned serious. Ah! What happened? The young wizards in the spells class were all startled by the unexpected blast. Even Professor Flitwick didn't expect the sudden explosion. The short head of the Ravenclaw house rushed over as fast as his short legs could carry him toward the site of the blast. Hey! Flitwick paused, stunned for a moment. He saw a faint golden barrier surrounding Harry, Ronald, and a few others, which encased a boy who now had a blackened face and hair that had puffed up into a ball. Relieved that the student wasn't seriously hurt, just dirty, Flitwick asked, "Are you okay, Seamus?" Yvonne swiftly dispelled the magic barrier, waved his wand, and quietly cast 2 spells, Scour Jiffy. Reparo. In an instant, the cracked and charred table returned to its pristine state, and Seamus' hair and clothes were magically restored as if nothing had happened. Oh! What a beautiful use of cleaning and repairing spells! Professor Flitwick's eyes widened in amazement as he looked at Yvonne in shock. I've never seen a first-year wizard cast those spells so smoothly. Gryffindor, 10 points. He declared. Thank you, Professor, Yvonne said, then turned to Seamus, asking a few questions to make sure the boy was all right. Seamus, still somewhat dazed, thanked Yvonne for helping him out. It's okay, Yvonne replied with a smile. Yvonne quickly resolved the situation and then asked, Professor, I have a few questions I'd like to ask you. Oh. Of course. Mr. Ambrosius. Flitwick responded, clearly flattered. Please call me Yvonne. Oh. What would you like to know, little Yvonne? He had a fondness for students with a thirst for knowledge, especially one like Yvonne, who was both exceptionally talented and polite. Well, Yvonne began with a slight smile, his tone calm but filled with curiosity. During the process of casting the illumination spell, I realized that the spell itself isn't necessarily required. It seems to be more of a psychological suggestion that helps solidify our intention. Yes, indeed, Flitwick nodded, agreeing with Yvonne. That's the basis of silent casting. After Flitwick's confirmation, Yvonne placed his wand on the table and extended his index finger. A ball of bright white light appeared at his fingertip, glowing steadily but without being blinding, instantly drawing the attention of the entire class. Merlin's beard! Flitwick exclaimed, completely taken aback. The little wizard before him had not only abandoned the verbal incantation for the illumination spell but had also cast the spell without a wand. This was something extraordinary. Silent and wandless casting, these were the pinnacle of spellcasting techniques in the wizarding world. How did you manage that? Flitwick asked, still in awe. While Flitwick had seen African wizards casting spells using hand gestures, that technique still involved drawing the symbols of the spells in the air. For example, the incantation for Avada Kedavra required the drawing of a lightning shape. Many spells, when cast with a wand, also traced specific trajectories in the air. But Yvonne. Flitwick watched closely, realizing that Yvonne wasn't drawing any runes with his fingers. Yvonne had truly completed the process of channeling magic solely with his mind. Just a few minor tricks, Yvonne said modestly as he picked up his wand again. Actually, what I want to ask isn't about the casting technique itself, but rather how the same spell can have different effects depending on how the magic power is mobilized. What? This time, not only did the group of young wizards look confused, but even Professor Flitwick seemed momentarily stunned. It's like this. Yvonne realized that words alone wouldn't be enough to explain, so he decided to demonstrate the results of his half-month-long research. Professor, look, this is the illumination spell cast with a standard amount of magic power. Lumos. Ivan recited the spell accurately, and a bright light glowed from the tip of his wand. He then began adjusting the output of his magic power and quickly pointed the wand toward the ceiling. But if I cast the spell using 10 times the usual magic power, it will look like this. Buzz. In an instant, the light above their heads became blindingly bright, making everyone feel as if they were staring directly into the sun. Fortunately, everyone focused their attention on Ivan, otherwise it would have been like what happened with him and Uamai, with his eyes stinging and tears streaming down his face. Chapter 43 Self-Created Spells. What just happened? It suddenly got super bright. The group of young wizards was in a state of confusion, but Ivan ignored the commotion. He turned to Professor Flitwick and calmly explained, "So, by doing this, for a brief moment, a blindingly bright light burst forth, enough to hurt the eyes." Flitwick stared at Ivan, utterly dumbfounded. He felt as though he was dealing with an imposter, not a normal first-year student. Is this something a young wizard should be figuring out? What is magic, really? Magic is not energy, and there's no conventional wisdom that suggests pouring more magic into a spell will increase its strength. The true force behind magic comes from emotions, specifically, the caster's state of mind. The more intense the emotions, like anger or desperation, the stronger the magic becomes. The concept of 10 times the magic power that Ivan mentioned was akin to using 10 times the force to lift a stone. Because of the excess force, the stone would fly uncontrollably. Oh, little Ivan. Flitwick, who now fully grasped what Ivan was experimenting with, was deeply concerned. This is incredibly dangerous. How can you alter the magic of a spell so recklessly? No, wait, how did you even manage to change the spell's magic in the first place? Flitwick couldn't wrap his head around it. You have to understand, most wizards in this world can't actually sense magic itself, only a select few can. Flitwick wasn't entirely sure how to define this select few, as he didn't realize how crucial the soul attribute was in perceiving magic. To put it simply, wizards in this world cast spells based purely on instinct or intuition. But what about Ivan? Because his soul was far more advanced than the average person's, Ivan could feel the connection between a spell and the magic behind it while casting. It was as if Ivan could assess the magic of the illumination spell and determine that its standard magic power was 1. Through constant and precise practice, Ivan absorbed a wide array of spells, comparing the differences between them. In this way, Ivan honed his control over magic power by relying on a near-perfect instinct and intuition, allowing him to alter how magic manifested in his spells. By Merlin's beard! You are incredibly brave! Professor Flitwick exclaimed. Professor Flitwick was well aware of the delicate relationship between magic power and spells, which was considered a highly advanced theory in the study of spellcasting. Wizards in the wizarding world can be roughly divided into 4 stages: young wizards, adult wizards, magic masters, and great magicians. These stages reflect a wizard's understanding and mastery of magic, not necessarily their strength, status, or power. For instance, Nicholas Flamel was a great magician. But due to his old age, Flamel's magical power had waned, making it difficult for him to cast more powerful spells. Similarly, most of the magic masters around the world either teach as professors at various magical institutions or retreat into their laboratories, continuing their solitary exploration of magical mysteries. Luna's mother, Pandora, was a magic master specializing in spells. Pandora loved to study various spells, and what she delved into was exactly what Ivan was now experimenting with, exploring how spells change when the strength of the magic behind them is altered. This kind of research is incredibly dangerous. A single mistake could lead to magic spiraling out of control. Pandora, in fact, lost her life during a spell experiment. You dare to conduct such research without taking any proper precautions? Flitwick's whole body trembled with fear, and the emotional, short professor nearly teared up from worry. He didn't know whether to call Ivan bold and reckless or ignorant and fearless. But Ivan had succeeded. I'll be more careful in the future. In the future. Flitwick was about to say something more, but Ivan quickly interjected, Professor, why don't you take a look at the results of my research? Ivan wouldn't have risked experimenting with the changes in magic power within spells without having full confidence in his abilities. After all, Ivan was an obscuralist, a wizard capable of harnessing and controlling an obscurus. Even if the magic truly went out of control, Ivan could merge with the obscurus in an instant to avoid any danger. The vitality and resilience of the obscurus were astonishing. In the state of the Black Storm, even if Ivan were blown to pieces, he could recover through whatever part of his body remained. Even if Ivan couldn't react in time, the Obscurus would automatically protect him from harm. It's similar to how Gaara's sand works in Naruto. The Obscurus is a parasitic entity. It lacks self-awareness but has independent emotions and can sense danger. With these dual layers of protection, Ivan had no fear. In the future, yes, hehe. Ahem. Professor. I've also experimented with constructed something out of scratch. This. Flitwick, however, remained deeply curious. Seeing this, Ivan smiled slightly and waved his wand. Lux Invia Primizit. This was a spell Ivan had created at the beginning of the school year. It summoned a glowing ball of golden light that floated ahead, leaving a trail of shimmering footprints to show the path clearly, the one he had used when arriving behind Hagrid. Oh, what a beautiful spell transformation, absolutely brilliant. Although he had advised Ivan to be cautious, Professor Flitwick couldn't help but get excited, almost bouncing with joy when he saw the magic effusion of multiple spells. It translates to light up the way ahead. Ivan briefly explained the principles of the spell to Flitwick. With Flitwick's deep knowledge of spells, it didn't take long for him to understand the essence of Ivan's magic. The spell Lux Invia Primizit wasn't particularly difficult, and with Flitwick's mastery of spellcraft, it would only take him a few days to master it fully, possibly controlling it even better than Ivan. There was nothing unusual about this. The experience of a Hogwarts professor far surpasses that of Ivan at this stage. Ivan's advantage lies in his 5 points of magic and soul, which serve as the foundation for his creativity. If you adjust the magic power and keep it around 3, focusing on more efficient utilization, it turns into something like this. Firefly Glimmer. As Ivan spoke, the students initially noticed no changes around them. Class was actually over at this point, but none of the young wizards wanted to leave. The Gryffindor students gazed at Ivan with admiration. With their Lion King present, how could they just walk out? As for the Ravenclaws, it was their thirst for knowledge driving them. They were eager to witness the birth of more unique magic from Ivan. Professor, could you help me with something? Ivan asked, seeing that Flitwick was also puzzled. Could you make the room darker? Oh, of course. With a wave of his wand, Flitwick shut all the windows tightly, blocking any remaining sunlight from entering. Yet, despite the darkened room, the desks, chairs, floor, and decorations began emitting a soft, blue glow. The light was gentle and mystical, causing the young witches to gasp in awe, as if they'd been transported to a fairy-tale world. Even Professor Flitwick was impressed by the magic's effect. Incredible understanding and transformation, he remarked. Though the required magic power has increased, you've managed to distribute it across the entire room. _______. A/N, in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, Credence Barebone is an example of a wizard who became an Obscurial, the person hosting the Obscurus, but showed remarkable control over the Obscurus, more so than typical Obscurials. However, the series doesn't provide a specific name for someone who can fully control an Obscurus, so Obscurialist seems a fitting term based on the lore. Chapter 44 I'm Famous. How did you come up with this idea, Ivan? This was inspired by a Muggle amusement park, Ivan replied. Amusement park? Professor Flitwick tilted his head, clearly unfamiliar with the term. But his lack of understanding didn't stop him from admiring Ivan's creativity. Including the original illumination charm, this was the third new spell Ivan had developed based on the same concept. With such talent on display, Flitwick couldn't help but ask eagerly, Ivan, would you be willing to share the secrets of these spells with others? Flitwick's ethics as a teacher were impeccable. If Ivan considered these spells to be his exclusive creations, the professor wouldn't push for an explanation. He would only explore the spell if Ivan willingly shared its details and allowed others to learn it. Of course. Ivan's answer surprised Flitwick. He responded casually, these spells aren't dangerous. They're just like other spells, only they're new. Perhaps the Firefly spell might be a bit tricky to learn, Ivan added, glancing at the other students, especially Hermione. But if anyone's interested, feel free to ask me privately. I want to learn. Hermione exclaimed enthusiastically. That Firefly spell is so beautiful. Another student chimed in. Ivan, how did you even come up with it? It's amazing. For a moment, several Ravenclaw girls crowded in front of Ivan, their admiration clear. When it comes to beautiful things, even a spell can captivate and draw attention, especially when it comes from a genius like Ivan, who seemed to shine like a beacon in the dark. His charm was irresistible, attracting their curiosity. Ugh! Only Hermione, who had been pushed aside, stood there fuming. Her eyes were full of dissatisfaction as she glared at the others. I was here first. Get away from my Yvonne. Fortunately, Professor Flitwick intervened and cleared the students away just in time, leaving Yvonne alone, as he clearly had something to discuss with him. Yvonne, have you heard of the wizarding magazine The Future of Spells? Flitwick asked. Yvonne thought for a moment. I've seen it in a bookstore, but I haven't read it. This is a publication dedicated to people worldwide who enjoy studying spells. It holds the same status in spell theory as Transfiguration today holds in Transfiguration, Flitwick explained. Flitwick then suggested that Yvonne publish his research on the 3 new spells in the future of spells. Of course, this is just my suggestion, he added. I'd be happy to. Yvonne responded. He wasn't the type to hoard magic for himself. Unless a spell was extremely important or needed to be kept secret, he saw no reason to withhold it. And these 3 spells were certainly not in that category. Rather than keep them to himself, Yvonne felt it would be better to share them openly. Firstly, publishing the spells would enhance Ivan's reputation. Secondly, it would also earn him a reward from the future of spells. Most importantly, it would help Yvonne expand his network and build good relationships with world-renowned magic masters. After all, who wouldn't admire a talented and generous young wizard? During lunch, Professor Flitwick invited Yvonne to the Great Hall, where they discussed the 3 spells and the finer details of getting them published. This scene naturally caught the attention of many students. The older students didn't recognize Yvonne, they only knew that he was a new student assigned to Gryffindor. However, the first-year students from the 3 houses Gryffindor, Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff quickly shared news of Ivan's latest achievements. I know him. Yvonne Ambrosius, said a first-year Hufflepuff enthusiastically at the house table, recounting Ivan's impressive performance in herbology class to the older students. He protected us, the student continued. He just raised his hand and told the mandrake to be quiet, and it stopped crying immediately. I also heard he used 3 spells of his own creation in the charms class, added another, recalling the demonstration Yvonne gave in Flitwick's lesson. Including that one spell he used to lead us when we arrived at school. That's incredible. Is he really just a first-year wizard? Marveled a senior Hufflepuff. Meanwhile, at the Ravenclaw table, the first-year students were also buzzing about the charms class. He can already create new spells, and we've only just started school. Look over there, said one of the excited Ravenclaws, pointing to Yvonne and Flitwick having lunch together. I've never seen Professor Flitwick talk to a first-year student during lunch like that before. Compared to other houses, Ravenclaw students have a deep admiration for wise individuals. They take pride in their intelligence, and Professor Flitwick, being one of the best, is a source of great respect for them. But now? Seeing Professor Flitwick's expression when speaking with Yvonne, his excitement so palpable that he seemed ready to break into a celebratory dance, made it clear just how remarkable Yvonne was. On the Gryffindor side, a crowd had gathered. I haven't talked with him much. Neville sat with red cheeks, feeling quite overwhelmed. Being Ivan's roommate had suddenly made him the center of attention, and everyone was bombarding him with questions. But how could Neville know anything? Even if he did, his shy and introverted nature meant he wouldn't have the confidence to share. Humph, that's Yvonne, he is. Hermione, sitting nearby, saw everyone letting Neville off the hook and spoke up, clearly a little displeased. He's what? Seeing that Hermione seemed to know more, the older Gryffindor students quickly gathered around her, eager to extract any useful information. Gryffindor loved heroic tales after all. Yvonne had performed spectacularly, and the young lions were eager to celebrate their newfound hero. Hermione paused for a moment, remembering the truth behind Ivan's identity. Ambrosius, the Eternal Family, the Immortal Descendant, the heir of Merlin. These titles were far too dazzling. Hermione didn't want Yvonne to stand out too much, so she carefully chose her words, avoiding the key details, and didn't reveal Ivan's true identity. Tisk. Meanwhile, over at the Slytherin table, the atmosphere was tense and quiet, a stark contrast to the excitement and admiration at the other 3 tables. The praise and admiration for Yvonne grated on the Slytherin's ears. A Mudblood from the Muggle world had already created and enhanced multiple spells, as soon as he entered Hogwarts. Why? The older Slytherin students might not have openly voiced their displeasure, but they were undoubtedly unhappy. Normally, the Slytherins took pride in their superiority, but now this mudblood was stealing all the attention and praise. Ivan's exceptional performance felt like a slap in the face to those purebloods who believed family lineage and heritage were paramount. Ambrosius, have you ever heard of that family in the wizarding world? Malfoy, still bitter from the lesson Ivan had taught him on the train, didn't dare provoke him directly, but he couldn't resist belittling him in private. However, even Malfoy had to admit that Ivan was truly remarkable. Malfoy was arrogant, attention-seeking, and always liked being in the spotlight, but he wasn't blind to the gap between himself and Ivan. In the original story, Malfoy had a love-hate relationship with Harry. Aside from their initial rivalry, the most significant reason was that, in Malfoy's eyes, Harry wasn't living up to his savior reputation. Compared to the legend of the boy who lived, after meeting him in person, Harry seemed to Malfoy like just a lucky boy with a scar. The same thing was happening with Ivan in Malfoy's own little twisted world. Malfoy, who had not yet experienced the humbling lessons life could offer, refused to admit that Ivan might actually be better than him. Chapter 45 MC Catgonagle. No. Never heard of it. The senior Slytherin students were also curious about Ivan's background. At least in the past 200 or 300 years, there hasn't been a prominent wizard named Ambrosius in the wizarding world. The pureblood ideology, despite its flaws, carried some reasoning. Even a witch like Hermione might have distant wizard ancestors, and their magical blood could have reappeared in her. Of course, that's just speculation. Muggles don't know about the existence of wizards, and wizards don't typically investigate these matters. But according to mainstream wizarding knowledge, Ivan's exceptional magical talent hinted at a significant magical lineage. Then he's nothing special, Malfoy scoffed. His father was on the school board, and the Malfoy family was incredibly wealthy. Even the Dark Lord once considered his father a trusted ally. Ivan, regardless of his magical abilities, would likely end up as just a Hogwarts professor in the future. Dumbledore? Malfoy sneered at the idea. If you're so great, why don't you kick Dumbledore out? In Malfoy's mind, unless Ivan could one day become the headmaster of Hogwarts, there was no reason to fear him. For now, he was just another student. Malfoy shifted his attention away from Ivan, stood up, and walked toward the Gryffindor table. Young Master Malfoy didn't want to bother with Ivan, he was now looking to pick a fight with Scarhead. Ivan noticed something unusual behind him. He glanced at Malfoy, who was getting closer to Harry, and he vaguely guessed that a confrontation was about to happen. In response, Ivan smiled to himself, Malfoy really does have a thing for Harry. Any other questions? No more. Ivan nodded. Thank you, Professor. Flitwick waved off the gratitude, saying it wasn't necessary. He was a professor, and it was his duty to help his students solve their doubts. During their conversation, Flitwick realized the extent of Ivan's talent. Although Ivan had only been learning magic for less than a month, the questions and ideas he raised surprised even Flitwick, a master duelist. Professor Flitwick didn't find answering Ivan's questions troublesome at all, in fact, he enjoyed it. He just reminded Ivan to be cautious and was happy to address his curiosities. I'll handle getting your spells published in the magazine, Ivan. You don't need to worry about it, Flitwick added. Flitwick was eager to see Ivan, as a first-year student, featured in the future of spells. It would be a proud moment for Hogwarts. After all, Hogwarts wasn't ranked very high among the 11 magical schools in the world. Thinking of the annual academic exchange meeting and discussing students with old friends from other countries, having an excellent student like Ivan to talk about, Flitwick suddenly felt excited. His small fists couldn't help but shake slightly with enthusiasm. Then I'll leave it to you, Professor, Ivan said with a laugh, noticing Flitwick's small but excited movements. There was a Transfiguration class scheduled for the afternoon, and Ivan had been looking forward to the older cat ladies class for a long time. Before school started, Ivan had studied Transfiguration on his own, but there were too many obscure aspects he couldn't fully grasp. Transfiguration was different from ordinary spells. It didn't have a fixed magical base, making it difficult for Ivan to analyze and break down like he could with improving or creating new spells. How could one describe it? If the illumination spell was set to A1 on a scale of magic, then Transfiguration would be a spell with a lower limit of 0 and an upper limit of infinity. Transfiguration involves the mind, will, and thinking. Through different proportions of these three elements, it can produce a variety of effects. And the core principle behind Transfiguration? 2 words: managing idealism. Yes, idealism. This was the conclusion Yvonne reached after studying all of Hogwarts Transfiguration textbooks. The basis of Transfiguration lies in idealism. What you want it to be, what attributes you want it to possess, and your subconscious definition of it. Then, the transformation was successful. Yvonne initially tried to approach Transfiguration with the scientific thinking from his previous life, but he quickly realized how naive it was to attempt applying science to the world of magic. To truly learn Transfiguration, one must first abandon the materialism of the previous life. Transfiguration is the most overpowered magic in this world. The more Yvonne delved into Transfiguration, the more unfathomable it became to him. It's no exaggeration to say that once you master the secrets of Transfiguration, the idea of making a wish come true would soon become a reality. Whether it's tangible animals or plants, or even non-living things like stones or metal. Even elements such as earth, water, wind, fire, and physical phenomena like temperature, air pressure, gravity, perhaps even space and time can be influenced by a wizard who knows how to use Transfiguration. Nothing in the world can escape the concept of change, and Transfiguration is about changing everything according to your wishes. In Ivan's mind, it wasn't an exaggeration to say that, compared to Transfiguration mastered by true wizards, black magic was simply insignificant. And now, the cat lady of Hogwarts, Professor McGonagall, was standing on the desk, scanning the little wizard seated in the classroom. Hee, she surprisingly looks cute. Maybe I can request her to play with Yumi. Imagining Yumi playing with a cat that suddenly transformed into McGonagall in front of her made Yvonne chuckle. Yvonne was sitting in the first row, and next to him was Hermione, who was diligently flipping through the textbook. Using his magical eye and spiritual vision, Yvonne could clearly see the difference between Animagus transformation and metamorphosis. The advanced level of transfiguration that old Dumbledore mentioned is indeed fundamentally different from temporary transformations. Yvonne narrowed his eyes slightly as he thought back to the flowers and trees in the wardrobe world. Interestingly, the traces of magic on the cat that Professor McGonagall had transformed into were strikingly similar to the plants and animals in the wardrobe world. Why is that? Yvonne mused. He had his own guess. Could that world have been created through the permanent transformation that Dumbledore mentioned? Permanent transformation. Animagus. As if realizing something profound, Yvonne closed his magic perspective and decided to stop thinking further. Sharp child, Professor McGonagall thought, noticing that Yvonne was observing her intently, though she wasn't surprised. I wonder just how talented Yvonne is in Transfiguration. Recalling how both Professor Sprout and Professor Flitwick had praised Yvonne, a smile played at the corner of the cat's mouth. She felt a surge of pride. After all, what kind of little wizards had the Sorting Hat assigned to her house before? Troublemakers, pranksters, mischief makers, the Weasley twins. I've suffered from their antics for years. McGonagall thought, imagining her weariness in the form of a sighing cat. But now, finally, she felt a sense of triumph. The Sorting Hat did something right for once. It knows who its real boss is. Their eyes met, and Yvonne smiled and nodded. McGonagall knew that Yvonne had figured out her Animagus form. But Professor McGonagall didn't immediately acknowledge Yvonne. She waited patiently, eager to gauge the reactions of the rest of the class. Hurry! Just as some students were quietly getting ready, Harry and Ron rushed into the classroom, looking flustered. We made it, Ronald panted, relieved when he saw no one standing behind the desk. If we were late, McGonagall would have given us a terrifying look. Yvonne glanced over at the cat on the desk and shook his head knowingly. Swish! At that moment, Professor McGonagall returned to her human form, startling many of the young wizards. Harry and Ron, in particular, were utterly shocked, their jaws dropping. That's amazing! Ron blurted out in awe. Thank you for your evaluation, Mr. Weasley, Professor McGonagall replied with a slight smile. Perhaps I should turn you and Mr. Potter into pocket watches, so that at least one of you will know how to keep time. We got lost, Professor, Harry mumbled, feeling embarrassed. It was his first Transfiguration class, and being late wasn't exactly how he wanted to make an impression. Then perhaps I should turn you into a map, McGonagall said dryly. Professor McGonagall did not really blame the two. Find your seat, you don't need a map for that, right? After that, McGonagall walked back to the desk and started the formal class. Everyone open the textbook. McGonagall explained the basic principles of Transfiguration to everyone, as well as some precautions. Does anyone know what the 5 exceptions are? After the words fell, a little hand was raised without a doubt. It was Hermione. Miss Granger, you answer it. There are 5 exceptions to Gamp's law of elemental transfiguration, namely, the limit of food transfiguration, the inability to permanently transform living and dead things, the inability to produce magical items by transfiguration, the inability to change the number of transfigurations, and the inability to create something out of nothing by transfiguration. Very good. Professor McGonagall smiled and nodded. Because of Miss Granger's excellent answer, Gryffindor will get 5 points. The little witch was very happy to get the extra points. After sitting down, she couldn't help but raise her head to Yvonne, as if to say, "Look, I can get extra points too." Chapter 46 Gamp's Law. Wizards can't conjure up delicacies out of thin air, nor can they turn other things into food. Even if you eat it, you can't absorb the nutrients, but will suffer from indigestion. Professor McGonagall ignored the 2 little ones flirting and continued, "But if you already have some food, you can transform it and make it bigger. Just like at the welcoming feast, the reason why there is food on the plate is not because it is conjured, but because the house elves cooked it and then transferred it to the container on the table through the relocation spell." Even Hermione didn't know this, which solved a little doubt in her heart. As for what house elves are, Hermione only thought they were employees and chefs hired by Hogwarts, and didn't think of them as servants at all. Secondly, there is no permanent transformation between living things and dead things. McGonagall continued, "We can turn a button into a scarab, but it cannot move forever. Once the attached magic power dissipates, it will return to a button. In addition, even if the transformed scarab has a breath of life, its essence is still a button. If you feed it to a bird, it will not fill its stomach, but will choke to death. This also involves the problem of food transformation. Transfiguration cannot create magical items, such as automatic quills, self-stirring cauldrons, or even galleons. The currency circulating among wizards has been enchanted by goblins. It will not oxidize, is not easily destroyed, and has the ability to automatically identify and count." After saying so much in a row, Professor McGonagall cleared her throat and continued, "Fourth, transfiguration cannot change the quantity, that is, you can't turn a table into 2 deer, or turn 3 quills into a shovel. But there is an exception. If the connected objects become a whole, they can be changed by total transfiguration, and even if they are turned back, it will not affect the arrangement and attachment of the original objects. That is to say, if I turn Mr. Potter and Mr. Weasley, who are wearing clothes, into a wild deer now, and then change them back, their clothes will still not stick to their bodies like fur." Harry and Ron, whose names were called, instantly felt the malice from the older cat lady. They were so scared that they couldn't help shrinking in their seats and secretly promised themselves never to be late for Transfiguration class again. Finally, and most importantly, Transfiguration cannot create something out of nothing. Perhaps you have seen senior students use their wands to conjure up a flock of birds or a bouquet of flowers, but these are definitely not Transfiguration, Professor McGonagall explained. Those things may just be limited-time entity projections summoned by spells, or they may have been conjured and hidden in the palm of their hands. Yvonne listened carefully, summarizing his doubts about the 5 exceptions. "Does anyone have any questions?" McGonagall asked after she finished speaking. The classroom fell silent, and even Hermione had no immediate questions. "Sure enough, I'll have to rely on you," Yvonne thought, seeing the expectant look in Professor McGonagall's eyes. He knew it was time for him to step in. "Professor, I have a question." When the other students saw that it was Yvonne, their surprised expressions quickly turned to understanding. It had only been 2 days since school started, but the first-year students were already well aware of Ivan's talent. This was a genius, operating on a different level from the rest of them. "What's your question, Mr. Ambrosius?" Professor McGonagall asked. "You mentioned the transformation between living things and dead things," Yvonne began. "What I want to know is, if a beetle is transformed into a button, how does the beetle maintain its life state during the transformation? Not to mention eating and drinking, but even just breathing, how does a beetle that has been turned into a button not suffocate to death? However, according to the principles of transfiguration, the beetle can be restored by casting the counterspell on the button. Interestingly, even after 1 or 2 hours, the beetle is still alive. So the question is, why is the beetle still alive? Students, this. Yes, doesn't the beetle that's been turned into a button need to breathe? The little wizards hadn't considered this question before. Even if they had seen their parents perform similar transformations between living and non-living things. "Good question," Professor McGonagall said with a slight nod, appreciating Ivan's insightful perspective. Magic is the power of the mind, and advanced transfiguration can even grant emotions to inanimate objects. Though turning a beetle into a button is something they would learn in the future, McGonagall gave Yvonne an answer in advance. The answer was simple, because of the wizard's intent. During the transformation, the wizard's intention is to turn the beetle into a button, not to kill it. Magic can read the wizard's subconscious thoughts and maintain the life of the creature even when it has been transformed into an inanimate object. They don't need to breathe or eat. Even after 3 days, when the button is turned back into a beetle, the beetle's life state remains exactly as it was at the moment of transformation. Of course, it's almost impossible for a single transfiguration to last for several days. I see, Yvonne nodded thoughtfully. Magic power and intent, the latter sets the goal, the former fulfills the wish. The reverse is also true. When a dead object becomes a living thing, where do the emotion and vitality of the living thing come from? Since magic can give life to dead objects, it can naturally sustain that life, preventing it from suffocating or starving. Then, Professor, under what circumstances will the effects of transfiguration fail? Yvonne asked. For example, if a transformed object is smashed, burned, or melted, where is the limit? Professor McGonagall paused for a moment, considering the question carefully before answering. The boundaries between living things and dead things are not exactly the same. With a wave of her wand, she turned a piece of paper on her desk into a lifelike owl. She wasn't at all annoyed by Ivan's question. In fact, Ivan's question prompted McGonagall to think further. It had to be said these were two very important questions worth exploring. Even a master of transfiguration like Professor McGonagall could gain valuable insights from them. Look, this is an owl made of paper. McGonagall cast a banishing charm at the owl, causing it to stagger in the air and lose a large number of down feathers. Coo! The owl screeched in panic before tumbling to the ground. However, the owl quickly got back up and took flight again. Interesting, Yvonne remarked, understanding the subtle detail McGonagall was demonstrating. The down feathers that fell off were originally part of the owl, yet their loss didn't affect the transformation. It was similar to turning a glass of water into wine. It wouldn't revert the wine back into water just because a few drops of wine were spilled. This was distinct from Gamp's law of elemental transfiguration, which dictates that the quantity of an object cannot be altered during transfiguration. But after the transformation, because the nature of the object had changed, the paper had become an owl. Naturally, the owl could now breathe, eat, and shed its feathers. Exactly, McGonagall nodded approvingly. Then, with another flick of her wand, she cast a crushing charm, turning the owl in midair into a pile of confetti. As for the feathers that had previously fallen, they vanished the moment the owl was crushed. Gulp! This scene left all the young wizards in the classroom thoroughly shocked. They had learned one very important thing: never offend Professor McGonagall. With such a decisive spell, McGonagall had no hesitation in vanquishing the owl she had transfigured, displaying the courage and authority of a true Gryffindor lioness. The young lions trembled in awe before the lioness. Yvonne frowned slightly, contemplating the difference between using a crushing charm and a banishing charm. Professor, could you transform something into a plant again? Yvonne requested. Of course, McGonagall responded with a smile, recognizing that Yvonne had grasped the key to understanding the boundary of living object transformations. The piece of paper on her desk transformed once again, this time into a vine that rapidly grew toward the ceiling, the sight leaving the students amazed at this magical feat. Bang! Yvonne was surprised for a moment, then raised his hand and cast a banishing charm on the vine. As the green leaves scattered, the vine snapped in two, and the students could even see the light green sap seeping from the severed section. Reducto! Yvonne then cast the reductor curse on half of the vine, shattering it into countless pieces of paper. But what's interesting is that the remaining vine still maintained its transformation and did not exit the transformation state because the other half was destroyed. Chapter 47: The Secret of Transfiguration. This. Ivan's pupils shrank slightly, and he looked at McGonagall in disbelief, even more shocked by Professor McGonagall's expertise in transfiguration. Is it because of the state of life, Professor? Yvonne asked. The owl was crushed, and in our perception, it was dead. The vine was cut, and even though part of it was destroyed, the rest could still survive. The survival here doesn't mean it was barely hanging on, but rather that it maintained its original transfigured state. The owl shed feathers, but those feathers would regrow. Thus, that type of damage doesn't disrupt the transfiguration. However, if the owl's wings were cut off, although the owl could still technically survive, it would lose its ability to fly, causing the transfiguration to fail. Of course, this also depends on the level of transfiguration skill the wizard possesses. Someone as skilled as Professor McGonagall has given the owl multiple inherent states during the transformation, making the owl's transformation extremely stable. Even if you sliced the owl with a knife, it would reveal internal flesh and blood organs. Because the target of Professor McGonagall's transfiguration is essentially a real living creature. In contrast, other wizards' transfiguration, the owl they might create could revert to its original form with just a simple touch. The attainment of transfiguration will affect the stability of the transformation. Yvonne continued, in addition, as long as the function of the transformed object changes, the transfiguration can no longer be maintained. For example, if you cut off part of the transformed vines, as long as some part remains, it can grow back. To put it simply, it can still be understood as the manifestation of intention in transfiguration. Because you have a specific need, your transformation can succeed. However, when the transformed object loses its intended function, the transfiguration will naturally dissipate. Just like a chair is meant for sitting, bread is meant for eating, and water is meant for drinking. If you render the chair unusable, consume the bread, or drink the water, the magic has already fulfilled the wizard's intended purpose. Then, Professor, what if the chair I conjured up isn't seen as a chair in my view, but rather just a piece of wood shaped like a chair? Yvonne asked. Of course, that is possible, McGonagall responded. Since the purposes are different, the methods for dispelling the transformation will naturally vary. If you need a functional chair, simply sawing off one leg will disrupt the transformation of the chair. On the other hand, if your intention is simply for it to resemble a piece of wood that looks like a chair, then breaking the transformation becomes much more challenging. You would either need to wait until the magic maintaining the chair is depleted or cast a counterspell. Otherwise, it is nearly impossible to destroy its stability. To conjure up a stone wall for defense, our intention can be for it to function as a wall, as a complete stone, or simply as the material itself. The first two purposes are relatively easy to disrupt. But if the wizard's intention is for it to exist purely as stone material, then its stability is significantly stronger. Since it is stone, a non-living material, you can smash it into pieces, but as long as the magic power isn't depleted, it will remain stone even after being crushed. Life transfiguration can be divided into animal transformation and plant transformation, while non-life transformation can be divided into consumable transformation and material transformation. The complexity of life transformation depends on the wizard's level of magical expertise. The higher the wizard's skill in transfiguration, the more realistic and stable the life they create becomes. As for the transformation of non-living things, it caters to the needs of wizards such as drinks, food, tools, and materials. Once the consumables are used up or the intended purpose is no longer fulfilled, the transformation will end. Do you understand, Yvonne? McGonagall asked. Yes, Yvonne replied gratefully, thank you for the explanation, Professor. Any other questions? 2 more questions. Yvonne asked, transfiguration can give material functions, but to what extent can it do that? For example, could you turn a stone into a watch? If that's possible, then can wizards transform stones into a TV, a refrigerator, or a computer? Professor McGonagall didn't know much about TVs, refrigerators, or computers, but she was familiar with telephones. Transfiguration can indeed create a phone, McGonagall replied. And the phone that is made will have the functions of power supply and communication. Good heavens! Yvonne once again confirmed his view that transfiguration is a universal magic. This even involves electrical signals. This is part of what is known as demand transformation, and wizards refer to it as subjective transformation, McGonagall continued. And if there is subjective transformation, there will naturally be objective transformation. Subjective transformation is easier to understand. When performing transfiguration, magic is used to analyze the structure of things, McGonagall explained. The more you know about the object, the higher the success rate and efficiency of the transformation. In theory, if a wizard could understand the structure and material composition of nuclear weapons, they could even transform a nuclear bomb into a giant mushroom. Did I say the other way around? Making a nuclear bomb? That's impossible. But this is magic. Yvonne felt a chill on his forehead. Transfiguration cannot change the substance itself, this is the basic rule of transfiguration. Even if you could make a nuclear bomb or a bullet, they would still be fake. In the words of Professor McGonagall, transfiguration can only change the state, not the nature of the substance. This rule cannot limit higher-level transfiguration. According to Dumbledore, permanent transformation can achieve real changes. The flaw of permanent transformation is that it cannot be altered by magic afterward. But this shortcoming is insignificant in the Muggle world because airplanes, tanks, rockets, and nuclear bombs lack magic and meet the standards of permanent transformation. So, what is objective transformation? Yvonne asked. Objective transformation is limited by the outside world's perception of the object, McGonagall explained. In simple terms, it's how others judge that the object you've transformed is indeed what it appears to be. For example, if Yvonne transforms something into an apple, how would others believe it's an apple? First, by its appearance, then by its texture, smell, and taste. If these are the same as the experience of a real apple, then outsiders will naturally believe it is a real apple. Similarly, suppose a stone is turned into a nuclear bomb. How do you determine whether it's a fake nuclear bomb? You certainly can't detonate it to check, that's impossible. So, using various detection methods, whether metal detection, radiation detection, or particle collision tests, you would conclude that it is real. Objective transformation is the transformation of various phenomena. Yvonne soon extracted the key information from the concept of objective transformation that Professor McGonagall had mentioned. In simpler terms, objective transformation is a form of sensory deception. For example, an apple can deceive people's 5 senses, and a nuclear bomb can deceive various detection instruments, making those tools believe they have detected real signals. However, these signals are false, merely a product of mental and statistical manipulation. Chapter 48 Navily, Can I Do It Too? Rip Maggie Smith. I'm certain she is in heaven, spending her time relaxing with her friends. She was a legend, and legends never die. Black Heart. Also, my little brother said that maybe she transmigrated into the HP world as Professor McGonagall for real, and I believe my lil bro on this. Underscore 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 underscore. Subjective transformation starts from the wizard, using their own thinking to analyze things and make them change according to the wizard's ideas. Objective transformation is based on the wizard's understanding, giving the transformed object the ability to interact with the outside world. For example, if Yvonne has eaten a particular kind of ice cream and knows its taste, he can transform water into that kind of ice cream. In this process, the higher the wizard's thinking attribute, the greater the scope for manipulation, and the higher the precision of the transformation. The same principle applies to deceiving machine detection. Only by understanding the underlying principles can a wizard perform transformations that are lifelike. Take Professor McGonagall as an example. She doesn't understand the intricacies of Muggle electronic devices. So, while she can transform electronic devices into small animals, plants, or other substances, she can't turn stones into functioning TVs. Even if she were to perform such a transformation, it would merely be an empty shell with the appearance of a TV, with its inner workings existing in a Schrödinger-like state. Thinking. At this moment, Yvonne fully grasped the importance of the thinking attribute. Its greatest manifestation in magic is in transfiguration. The thinking attribute serves as a tool for exploring the world, enabling calculation, analysis, and understanding. If one day Yvonne masters magical transformation and permanent transformation, along with a sufficiently high level of thinking, he might indeed become like a god, capable of creating anything. I have one last question, Professor. Yvonne and McGonagall continued their discussion, paying no mind to the confused looks of the other little wizards. The only one who could follow along was Hermione. Even then, Hermione could only grasp the general meaning of their conversation. But when it comes to magic, Hermione is completely confused. Can air be transformed? Professor McGonagall frowned slightly. She found that Ivan's question was indeed a bit unusual. Tricky? Not quite, because every question Yvonne asked touched upon the fundamental aspects of transfiguration, including the question about air transformation, which is also a very important topic. No. McGonagall shook her head and said, transfiguration cannot transform air. What about wind? In Ivan's understanding, there are magics in the wizarding world that can summon wind, create clouds, fog, and even storms. If air cannot be transformed, then what exactly are those spells? Yvonne, what you're referring to isn't transfiguration. McGonagall clarified, Transfiguration doesn't just alter the appearance of something, it changes its essence. If what Yvonne wanted was merely to manipulate the shape of gas, that would fall under a different category of magic, more akin to elemental control like the spells used to manipulate fire or water flow. The real air transformation should involve turning air into water, food, plants, or animals. However, such feats, perhaps only gods could achieve them. I just mentioned that transfiguration cannot change the number of objects, so how do we define this number? Have you ever thought about that? McGonagall looked directly into Ivan's eyes and said seriously, we cannot turn two separate apples into a single entity. Are apples and apples really separated by nothing? No, there is something between them, and that is air. Some might think that what separates matter is space. But in reality, the concept of separation in transfiguration does not extend to the manipulation of space. Even separating air is already pushing the boundaries of magic. Additionally, this also implies that wizards' transfiguration cannot transform individual molecules, such as an oxygen molecule or a water molecule. Yvonne didn't know what the upper limit of transfiguration was. But as for the lower limit, bacteria and viruses aside, molecules and atoms are certainly beyond the scope of ordinary wizards' transfiguration. After the transfiguration class, Yvonne stood up and left. The little wizards around him made way and watched as Yvonne and Hermione walked out together. What's wrong? Yvonne was taken aback. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but the little wizards were full of admiration. Especially the young lions in Gryffindor House, who almost instinctively saw Yvonne as their leader and wanted to protect him. Even the students in Ravenclaw were impressed by the knowledge Yvonne had displayed during his exchange with Professor McGonagall. That guy. So cool. Ron and Harry also walked alongside Yvonne. Ron was envious and wished he could carry himself with the same authority as Yvonne. Harry, on the other hand, hoped Yvonne could teach him a few spells. He didn't expect to be as impressive as Yvonne, but mastering one or two spells would be enough to satisfy him. Yvonne, you were incredible. Following close behind, Hermione eagerly praised his conversation with McGonagall, her eyes filled with admiration. At only 12 years old, the young witch looked up to Yvonne as her idol. It's nothing, Yvonne replied modestly. He then noticed Neville, who appeared a bit shy, and invited Hermione to their dormitory that evening. He planned to continue teaching Hermione magic and hoped that she could also help teach Neville a few spells. Though Neville was slow to catch on, he was a Longbottom, and his magical bloodline was certainly strong. What Neville lacked was confidence and a mind affected by the effects of the memory charm. But this wasn't a big problem. Yvonne valued Neville's simplicity and loyalty. Since he had decided to become the White Lord, his personal strength was crucial, but so were the allies and followers he would gather around him. Hermione and Neville were undoubtedly the two people closest to Yvonne at Hogwarts. Can I do it too? Neville asked hesitantly, lacking confidence. Hermione quickly encouraged him, Yvonne is amazing, Neville. You need to believe in his teaching ability. She thought it might be asking too much for Neville to work harder immediately, but there was no excuse for him not to trust Yvonne. Yet. Sure enough, Neville understood what Hermione meant and admired Yvonne even more. That evening, the three of them had dinner in the Great Hall and then headed to Yvonne and Neville's dormitory as planned to practice magic together. According to Hogwarts school rules, girls could enter the boys' dormitory, but the opposite was not allowed. Moreover, Yvonne and Neville were the only ones in their dormitory, which made things a lot easier. Meow. On the dormitory floor, Umi and Crookshanks were playfully wrestling while Trevor, Neville's pet, stayed off to the side, staring at the door. However, with two big cats more like crazy raccoons by his side, the poor, weak and helpless toad had no chance to play its disappearing game. Ahem. Yvonne placed 3 sofas and a table in the open space in the dormitory, and placed the textbooks for transfiguration, charms, herbology and potions on top. Neville, don't be nervous. Seeing that Neville was a little embarrassed, Yvonne comforted him, Hermione and I have held many study sessions. This is no big deal. Yes, Neville. Hermione had a good impression of the shy boy, and with her and Yvonne here, there was no reason that Neville couldn't be taught. Chapter 49 Study Session. Let's get started, Neville. Your goal is to master the first spell taught by Professor Flitwick in class, the lumos spell. Yvonne selected the basic spells from the textbook and carefully broke them down, explaining the principles behind them and offering tips on casting spells to Hermione and Neville, based on his own understanding. The little witch was truly brilliant. She noted down everything Yvonne said, and whenever something wasn't clear, she asked questions immediately. Yvonne noticed that Hermione had an impressive finesse when it came to controlling magic. This wasn't due to willpower but rather a demonstration of her high level of thinking. However, compared to Hermione, who grasped things almost instantly, Neville's situation was far more challenging than either of them had anticipated. To be honest, teaching Neville was making Yvonne feel the weight of the task. Sorry, Yvonne," Neville mumbled, his head hanging low as tears welled up in his eyes. "I'm just too stupid." Yvonne glanced at the time. It was already 8 o'clock in the evening. 3 hours had passed, and apart from guiding Hermione at the beginning, Yvonne had devoted almost all of his attention to Neville. While this process did help Yvonne identify gaps in his teaching, the lack of progress was starting to give him a headache. "There's no reason to be sorry," Yvonne muttered to himself. Yvonne wasn't upset, he was very patient and didn't dislike Neville's struggles at all. A transparent light shield, faintly glowing, enveloped the three of them, shielding the dormitory from any potential damage caused by their spell practice. This was something Yvonne had specifically prepared for Neville. Its prototype was derived from the Protogo spell, and Yvonne had mixed it with elements from the Protogo totem and the general protective charm. It was the most complex spell Yvonne had created so far. He called it the Body Protection spell, also known as Exorcism and Body Protection. The spell's upper limit wasn't particularly high, but its strength lay in its sustainability and adaptability. For instance, right now, Yvonne had divided the practice area into 2 sections, like 2 bubbles touching each other, one side for him and Neville, the other for Hermione. Without this precaution, Yvonne wouldn't have felt confident or safe allowing the two to cast spells inside the dormitory. "I need to think about it carefully. Neville, you should look over the herbology material for now," Yvonne said, temporarily stumped on how to help Neville. Neville obediently took out his books, showing no discouragement and following Ivan's instructions without hesitation. "What's going on with Neville?" Hermione asked quietly. Yvonne frowned and replied, "I think he might have been affected by a crude version of the Obliviate spell when he was younger, which damaged his cognitive abilities." "Oh my! What can be done about it?" Hermione asked with concern. Yvonne had already shared with Hermione the 6 basic attributes he had defined. Thinking, as Yvonne described it, included factors like reaction time, body coordination, spell control, memory, and calculation ability. 4 points in thinking doesn't mean that all subcategories need to reach 4 points. In fact, if any of the subcategories reaches 4 points, the thinking attribute can be considered 4 overall. Take Harry, for example. Yvonne believed Harry had a thinking attribute of 4, just like Hermione, but their strengths were different. Harry's high thinking score was reflected in his quick reaction time, giving him an unparalleled advantage in Quidditch and combat. Hermione's thinking was reflected in her learning, but when it came to physical skills, she was no different from an average person. "Let me think about it some more," Yvonne said, feeling somewhat helpless regarding Neville's struggles. The one thing he was sure of was that Neville's potential wasn't lacking, and his future held promise. The reason Neville was having difficulties might have been due to his young age and his current lack of mental maturity. "I'll try my best to help Neville build a strong foundation," Yvonne finally decided. He resolved to help Neville practice spell manipulation as much as possible, helping him develop muscle memory. There wasn't much else Yvonne could do for now. Neville's memory was truly poor, whether it came to recalling information or grasping understanding. And so, the three of them studied together into the night. Although Yvonne spent most of his time teaching Hermione spell-casting techniques, Neville managed to pick up a few things as well. Well, at least before he forgot the knowledge, Neville felt like he had mastered it. So, he went to bed, and the next day. "Neville, hey? What did I master?" Yvonne and Hermione were eating breakfast in the Great Hall, secretly holding their foreheads and feeling helpless about Neville's forgetfulness. Fortunately, neither of them was the type to give up easily. They didn't resent Neville for his struggles, and this kindness touched the shy boy deeply. From childhood to now, aside from his family, Yvonne and Hermione had been the kindest to him. Neville wasn't lacking in perseverance. He genuinely worked hard and listened carefully. However, his memory was terrible. He thought he had memorized many things, but would forget them not long after. Neville could only repeat the lessons over and over again to make sure Yvonne and Hermione's efforts weren't wasted. "In this class, we will learn how to turn a match into a needle." The Transfiguration class officially began, and the first thing they had to learn was how to transfigure a matchstick into a needle. In class, Yvonne didn't even need to use his wand. He simply waved his hand, and the matchstick on the desk transformed into an extremely thin silver needle. Not only that, but Yvonne also engraved patterns on the silver needle, bit by bit, making it even more intricate. Beautiful transfiguration. Professor McGonagall immediately noticed Ivan's performance. No wand, no sound, and precise casting. Even though Professor McGonagall was mentally prepared, she was still amazed by Ivan's skill and talent. Gryffindor gets 5 points for Mr. Ambrosius' outstanding performance. Soon after Yvonne, Hermione also successfully transformed her matchstick into a silver needle, and Professor McGonagall awarded Gryffindor an additional 2 points for her achievement. This delighted Professor McGonagall for the better part of the class, until our resident explosion expert, Mr. Seamus, once again demonstrated his unique ability to turn every spell into an explosive one. Hold your wand firmly and clearly picture the shape of the needle you want to transform the match into. Yvonne sat in a row with Hermione and Neville, with Harry and Ronald on his other side. At that moment, Harry was asking Yvonne for advice on the technique for transfiguring a matchstick into a silver needle. Yvonne didn't hold back and explained the key principles of transfiguration to Harry, based on his current understanding. I did it. With Ivan's guidance, Harry quickly grasped the trick. He held up his matchstick, which now had one pointed end, and was ecstatic. Thank you, Yvonne, you're amazing. The slight change in the match seemed small to Yvonne, but it was a crucial first step for Harry. As for Ronald, well, I think you should consider getting a new wand. Yvonne really couldn't offer much advice to Ron. He had no ill will toward him, but no particularly strong feelings either. So, he straightforwardly told him that the problem wasn't necessarily with Ron himself, but with the wand he was using. The old wand was not compatible with Ron's magic at all. In addition, Ron's basic attributes were very mediocre, which meant that he was destined to have a hard time achieving great success. Chapter 50 Not to be messed with. Yvonne was not without a solution. But he had no reason, nor the inclination, to help Ron improve his attributes. Yes, improve attributes. During his time at Hogwarts, Yvonne had discovered a way to enhance one's attributes' magical transformation, rituals. Magical transformation was an extremely advanced subject, encompassing knowledge of potions, spells, transfiguration, and even dark magic. It was an important method for ordinary wizards to ascend to the ranks of top-tier wizards. However, magical transformation was extremely risky, with a survival rate of only 1 in 10, essentially a gamble with one's life. Looking around Hogwarts, Yvonne knew that even professors like McGonagall, Flitwick, and Sprout had never attempted magical transformation, and they remained ordinary wizards. For most wizards, becoming a master of magic was the highest level they could hope to achieve. Yvonne, who had read the original books and seen the films, understood very well that the gap between magic masters and true great wizards was a chasm the former could scarcely comprehend. No wonder reaching 5 points in an attribute is considered legendary, Yvonne thought to himself. He possessed the magic eye and spiritual vision, which, combined with his ability to see magic on a deeper level, gave him an unparalleled advantage when it came to understanding magical transformation. Unfortunately, despite his research, Yvonne had yet to find any books on magical transformation in the library. He suspected that the relevant materials were likely hidden away in the restricted section. I won't be able to rely on myself for everything in the future, Yvonne reflected. At the moment, the only people he could truly trust were Hermione and Umi. This cat and person were his confidants. Though the little witch was talented, Yvonne could already see the limits of her future potential. At best, she would reach the level of Professor McGonagall and become a master of spells. But with me guiding her, she should be able to go further beyond that, Yvonne thought confidently. His plan was to study diligently at Hogwarts for a few years. Once he accumulated enough knowledge, he would begin conducting experiments starting with small animals, and eventually Umi. Unless the magical transformation was successfully completed on Umi, Yvonne wouldn't dream of risking Hermione's life. Umi, thanks a lot my human. Sarcastically, of course. All right, children, today's class is over, Professor McGonagall announced, signaling the end of the lesson. The young wizards put down their wands one by one. Yvonne glanced around and realized that, aside from him and Hermione, no one had fully succeeded in their first transfiguration lesson. At best, a few like Harry had managed to transform one end of the match into a needle. But the majority, including Ronald, Neville, and Seamus, hadn't managed any transformation at all. Next up was the class all the young wizards eagerly anticipated, defense against the dark arts. However, Yvonne didn't have high hopes for it. Sure enough, in the defense against the dark arts class, Professor Quirrell's performance was almost laughable. The classroom where he taught was filled with the overwhelming smell of garlic. Everyone said that this was to ward off a vampire Quirrell claimed to have encountered in Romania. He feared the vampire might return to capture him. Quirrell also boasted about his scarf, saying it was a gift from an African prince, who had supposedly rewarded him for helping banish resurrected zombies. But whether anyone actually believed him was another story altogether. During the class, Seamus Finnegan had the nerve to ask how Professor Quirrell defeated the resurrected zombies. Quirrell's face turned beet red, and he stammered, mumbling something about the weather, clearly trying to dodge the question. This guy acts like a complete fool, Yvonne thought to himself, watching the scene unfold. He suspected that Quirrell actually believed his poor acting skills were enough to deceive everyone at Hogwarts, including Dumbledore. But to Yvonne, Quirrell's performance practically screamed, "I have a problem. Voldemort must have lost some of his cunning by splitting his soul like that, and now he's relying on someone like this to host him," Yvonne mused, shaking his head. Still, given Voldemort's desperate state in the forests of Albania, perhaps he couldn't afford to be picky. After class, Hermione and Neville flanked Yvonne on either side, walking with him down the corridor. Hermione, usually a respectful student, was visibly frustrated. "Yvonne," she said with a frown. "Hogwarts' defense against the dark arts class is such a letdown." It wasn't like Hermione to speak ill of her teachers, but even she couldn't help it this time. Quirrell's pitiful display was far below her expectations. "Nothing unusual, headmaster always invites this type of guys. No sane person will accept this post after all," Yvonne said calmly. "I heard that the defense against the dark arts class at Hogwarts is cursed. The professor for this course can never teach for more than a year. Is that true?" Hermione's eyes widened in surprise, and Neville looked frightened, as if something terrible might happen in their defense against the dark arts class. "Don't worry," Yvonne reassured them. "The curse doesn't affect students, only the professors." "That's still scary," Hermione said, already beginning to wonder if she should comfort Professor Quirrell. After all, he was risking himself to teach them despite his poor teaching skills. "Relax," Yvonne continued. "If Hogwarts dares to hire him and Professor Quirrell dared to apply, there shouldn't be any real danger. Professors at Hogwarts aren't forced to stay, if it gets too much, they can resign. Dumbledore wouldn't let anything bad happen to them." As they walked and talked, it was mostly Yvonne and Hermione carrying the conversation, with Neville quietly listening alongside them. "Oh, by the way," Yvonne said, remembering something important. "Let's be cautious in tomorrow's potions class. Keep a low profile." "What?" Hermione and Neville exchanged confused looks, unsure of what Yvonne meant. "You'll understand tomorrow," Yvonne replied, not elaborating further. He then led the two to the library, where they planned to borrow some books and take them back to the dormitory to read later. The potions class was held in a basement classroom. It was much colder there than in the main part of the castle above. Glass jars lined the walls, filled with animal specimens floating in murky liquid, making the place feel even more unsettling. When Yvonne, Hermione, and Neville arrived, several students were already seated in the classroom. Most of them were from Slytherin. For first-year students, potions was a shared class between Slytherin and Gryffindor, and this would be Ivan's first formal encounter with the Slytherin students. Malfoy, along with his usual companions, Goyle and Crabbe, sat together. A short girl, Pansy Parkinson, was seated near them. Yvonne remembered her name from the introductions. "Look who it is!" Malfoy sneered as soon as he spotted Yvonne. In a mocking tone, he added, "The famous Yvonne Ambrosius. Everyone's saying you're the most outstanding first-year wizard." Yvonne raised an eyebrow, stopping Hermione from responding before she could speak. He calmly replied, "Oh, what was your name?" "Ah. Malfoy, I remember meeting you in the train." "Alas, I don't really understand your logic." "That. Let's not talk about that meeting." "Yeah, it wasn't a pleasant one after all." Yvonne chuckled. Their brief exchange quickly attracted the attention of the other students in the room, but no one seemed eager to get involved. Malfoy, with his pure-blood background and aristocratic family status, commanded a certain level of attention among the first years, especially in Slytherin. Yvonne was even more extraordinary. He was born in the Muggle world, but in just a few days, the magic talent that Yvonne showed in class was enough to make all the young Gryffindors look up to him. In a word, the two were not people they could mess with. Chapter 51 The Source of Malfoy's Entertainment. But really, I don't understand your thinking logic. What? Malfoy was clearly confused by Ivan's casual words. What did he mean by I don't understand your thinking logic? What I mean is... Yvonne didn't dislike Malfoy, he was just a spoiled child. If it ever came to it, someone like Dudley, who frequently bullied Harry, would probably be turned into a maggot by now. Don't you see the difference between us? Yvonne added as he casually sat down at the table near Malfoy. Seeing this, Hermione stepped forward and sat down next to Yvonne, playing the role of a supportive friend. Neville, looking nervous but determined, followed and took a seat with them, even though he was clearly scared. Suddenly, the table was filled with Malfoy, Goyle, Crabbe, Pansy, Yvonne, Hermione, and Neville, making for a rather awkward gathering. What are you trying to do? Malfoy stammered, obviously startled by Ivan's confident demeanor. He still remembered the encounter on the train, where Yvonne had overpowered him with ease. In a moment of panic, Malfoy regretted provoking Yvonne. My father is one of the Hogwarts school governor. Malfoy blurted out defensively. You. Relax. I'm not going to do anything, Yvonne said, patting Malfoy on the shoulder with a smile. We're classmates, after all. No need for things to be so tense between us, right? Crabbe and Goyle stood frozen in fear of Yvonne, while Pansy, who had witnessed Ivan's magical talent during their entrance, wisely chose to stay quiet. Though she had a crush on Malfoy, she wasn't foolish enough to challenge someone as skilled as Yvonne and make a fool of herself. Of course, there would be no shortage of protection. A girl in love, how could she tolerate the boy she liked being bullied? However, before Pansy could make any move, Ivan's eyes fell on her. In an instant, Pansy trembled all over, as if she had fallen into an ice cave, and was frozen on the spot. But, Yvonne said, shocking the love-struck girl, and then continued, you have to understand one thing, Draco. In the wizarding world, magic is power. Yvonne did nothing but simply stared into Malfoy's eyes, silently. The invisible sense of oppression made Draco feel incredibly stressed, and any impulse to provoke Yvonne quickly vanished. I know, Malfoy stammered, visibly shaken. Deep down, he didn't want another conflict with Yvonne. After all, when you think about it, what real conflict existed between them? Hermione? Mudblood? Muggle-born wizard? Let's not even get into Hermione's situation right now. Malfoy simply looked down on her. And there was nothing he could do about it. The dynamics of the wizarding world were like this: Muggle-borns, or Mudbloods, had always been at the bottom of the wizarding society's hierarchy of contempt. Contempt, disdain, and the theory of blood purity, these things existed even in Ivan's previous life. The rich looked down on the poor. Those with good jobs looked down on those with bad jobs. Those with beautiful, virtuous, and capable wives looked down on the single dogs. So, what do you do when someone looks down on you? Are you supposed to just let it slide? Yvonne thought, yes, if someone looks down on me, I'll definitely beat them up. If you don't have the strength, you might have to endure it. But if your fists are big enough, why put up with it? So, when Malfoy called Hermione a mudblood, on the train Yvonne acted swiftly and taught this arrogant brat a lesson. You can think whatever you want in your head, Yvonne figured, but the moment you say it out loud, you're crossing the line. Magic is power. If you can't beat me, then keep your mouth shut and save yourself the trouble. Arr. Malfoy was speechless under Ivan's forceful attitude. He sat there with an extremely sour expression on his face, but he didn't dare lose his temper with Yvonne. He could only sit and bear it. When Harry and Ronald arrived, they saw the scene unfold. Malfoy and his cronies were sitting in the corner, looking frustrated, while on the other side, Yvonne, Hermione, and Neville were calmly flipping through their potions textbooks. What happened? Soon enough, Harry and Ronald learned what had transpired from Seamus. Apparently, Malfoy had tried to start trouble with Yvonne. But before he could make a move, Yvonne made Malfoy back down with just a few words, and Malfoy even distanced himself from Yvonne. This news made Harry and Ron thrilled. Unfortunately, before they could revel in it, a dark figure swept into the classroom, exuding an aura of intimidation. Yvonne glanced up to see the man dressed in black robes, a cloak billowing behind him. He was tall and slender, with greasy, straight hair, cold, deep-set eyes, and a sallow complexion. The figure resembled a large black bat. Severus Snape, the most skilled wizard in the entire Harry Potter series, second only to Dumbledore and Voldemort. He had inherited his mother's talent for potions and demonstrated an aptitude for inventing spells as soon as he entered Hogwarts. To be honest, if it weren't for Lily, Snape might not have ever reached the heights of greatness as a wizard. What a pity, Yvonne thought. This was the first time Yvonne had seen Snape since the opening feast, and as the head of Slytherin entered the room, he brought with him a palpable sense of foreboding, casting a heavy shadow over the young wizards. Snape stood at the front of the classroom, reading out the list of names. When he reached Harry's name, he paused. At that moment, Harry had no idea what sort of targeting he was about to endure. It's starting Harry Potter's famous scene, Yvonne thought, remaining calm and showing no intention of stepping in to help Harry. After all, if one looked at it plainly, this was an issue rooted in the sins of Harry's father. As the saying goes, the hatred of losing a lover is irreconcilable. It was remarkable that Snape could restrain his anger whenever he looked at Harry, who bore such a strong resemblance to James Potter. The beloved goddess was stolen by the rogue with messy hair. Yvonne mused. In an effort to protect her, Snape chose to become a double agent, silently sacrificing everything without expecting anything in return. And after the goddess died, Snape devoted his life to protecting her son, the son of that man who had taken her away. To make matters worse, the boy, Harry, except for his green eyes, looked almost exactly like the man who had stolen Snape's love. Damn! It's so utterly incredible. Thinking about all this, Yvonne couldn't help but admire Snape's resilience. He truly was the ultimate first love martyr in the Harry Potter series. Strong. Really strong. You really are the first true man of the wizarding world, Yvonne thought, his mind marveling at Snape's sheer perseverance. What did you say, Yvonne? Hermione overheard Yvonne mutter something under his breath but didn't catch it clearly, so she asked. Oh, nothing. Yvonne didn't explain and instead casually praised, I was just thinking how impressive our potions professor is. Really? Hermione didn't press further. She trusted Ivan's judgment and now had high hopes for Snape's teaching abilities. Very good, very good. At that moment, Snape raised his head from the list and directed his gaze toward Harry. Harry Potter, our new celebrity, he said with a cutting tone. Malfoy, along with Crabbe and Goyle, snickered, covering their mouths with their hands. Seeing Harry being singled out by Snape, the frustration Malfoy had felt from his encounter with Yvonne vanished instantly. I should never have tried provoking Yvonne, Malfoy thought to himself. Is Harry losing his appeal, or has Scarhead given up? No, right? At that moment, Malfoy made a decision. The source of my entertainment should always be Harry Potter. Chapter 52 Snape, there's something wrong with this kid. Yvonne Ambrosius. Hearing Snape call his name, Yvonne nodded slightly toward him, his demeanor composed, neither humble nor arrogant. Another kid who thinks he's a celebrity, Snape muttered, but didn't dwell on it. He continued calling names, and then looked up at the entire class. His eyes were dark and empty, giving off the eerie feeling of two endless tunnels. You are here to learn the precise science and exact art of potion making. Snape's voice was barely louder than a whisper, yet every word carried through the room with a chilling clarity. His presence alone commanded order in the classroom. Since there is no foolish wand-waving here, many of you will doubt this is real magic. I do not expect you to truly appreciate the subtle beauty of a cauldron with its shimmering fumes or the delicate power of liquids that creep through human veins, bewitching the mind and ensnaring the senses. I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even put a stopper in death, but only if you aren't as big a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach. When Snape finished his brief speech, the classroom fell into an awkward silence. Harry and Ronald exchanged confused looks, eyebrows raised. Hermione Granger, on the other hand, had shifted to the edge of her seat, practically leaning forward, eager to show that she was anything but an idiot. Only Yvonne remained calm, quietly waiting for Snape's usual outburst. He knew the potions master's temper all too well. With Harry in front of him to attract Snape's ire, Yvonne simply sat back and enjoyed the show in silence. Snape didn't have a general disdain for celebrities, his resentment was reserved exclusively for Harry Potter. Potter. As Yvonne predicted, Snape barked impatiently, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? What root powder to what infusion? Harry glanced helplessly at Ronald, who was just as lost as he was. Hermione, sitting next to Yvonne, instinctively started to raise her hand, but then she remembered Ivan's earlier warning. Yvonne. She looked to him, but Yvonne shook his head slightly in response. Resisting the urge to answer and earn extra points, Hermione begrudgingly remained silent and turned her attention to Harry, waiting for his reply. I don't know, sir. Harry admitted, clueless. He could feel the intense dislike radiating from Snape, and he didn't care for this cold, dark professor whose hair looked as though it hadn't seen a wash in ages. Tisk tisk. Snape sneered, his lip curling in disdain. Fame clearly isn't everything. Let's try again. Snape, Potter, if I ask you to find me a bezoar, where would you find it? Harry was silent once again, he didn't even have the slightest idea what a bezoar was. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle, sitting not far away, were laughing so hard that they were practically shaking with glee. Especially Malfoy. If he hadn't been worried about Snape's reaction, he would have laughed out loud in Harry's face. I don't know, sir. I don't think you've cracked open a single book before coming to school, have you, Potter? Harry forced himself to meet Snape's cold, piercing gaze. When he was with the Dursleys, he had gone through all his books. But how could Snape expect him to memorize every single detail of 1,000 magical herbs and fungi? Was that even humanly possible? Hermione, yes, I can. Potter, then tell me the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane. I don't know. The blatant targeting made Harry's blood boil. He glared at Snape, seething, while Snape, in turn, gazed into Harry's emerald green eyes with something resembling nostalgia hidden behind the coldness. Just looking at that infuriating face, which resembled that man, made Snape's anger boil over. How could this be happening? Hermione, unable to bear it any longer, whispered to Yvonne, does he have some grudge against Potter? Harry Potter, the savior of the wizarding world, was revered by so many witches and wizards. It was hard to imagine anyone treating him with such disdain. But Snape's attitude was downright baffling to Hermione. Is he jealous of Harry? Could that be it? You answer it. Snape snapped, having overheard Hermione's whisper. His gaze, sharp as a snake's, locked onto her, and he asked her to answer the questions he had thrown at Harry earlier. Pfft! Yvonne, trying but failing to contain himself, let out a laugh. For a moment, the whole class fell silent. Even Snape paused, frowning at Yvonne. Sorry, Professor, Yvonne said after a quick cough. I just remembered something amusing. Yvonne hadn't expected Snape to direct his ire at Hermione. Professor. Hermione, seeing where this was heading and fearing Snape might turn his wrath on Yvonne, quickly answered, mixing an infusion of wormwood with powdered root of asphodel creates a sleeping potion so powerful it's known as the draught of living death. The bezoar, also referred to as coprolite, is a stone taken from the stomach of a goat and is known for its strong detoxifying properties. As for monkshood and wolfsbane are the same plant, also known as aconite. Hermione's answers were flawless, straight out of the potion textbooks. Snape, however, seemed unimpressed. He didn't know much about Hermione's background but had heard from other professors about an extraordinary young wizard this year, Yvonne, rumored to be a descendant of the legendary Merlin. Hat. Inwardly, Snape scoffed. To him, it was nothing more than a tedious myth. Frustrated by not regaining the upper hand, Snape asked Hermione several more challenging questions. The little witch answered them smoothly, barely missing a beat before giving perfect responses. It seems, Snape said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, that compared to certain others, the young witch who can memorize entire books stands out. He added, at least in rote memorization, the Miss Know-It-All is a shining example for certain people. Hermione, who had been hoping Snape might award her points for her excellent answers, now felt more deflated than pleased. Unfortunately, the little witch was not good at contradicting the professor. Sit down. Snape asked Hermione to sit down with dissatisfaction, and he glanced at Yvonne, who seemed to be watching a show. He didn't like Ivan's eyes. However, for some reason, Snape was reluctant to provoke this strange little wizard. He couldn't explain this feeling. It was like a poisonous snake smelling the scent of a beast and knew that the other party was very difficult to mess with. It was not worth confronting it when there was no benefit. Chapter 53 Harry's Invitation. Why didn't you all write it down? After glaring at Yvonne for a few seconds, Snape finally gave up trying to pick a fight with him and turned his frustration elsewhere, scolding the rest of the class in a low voice. Suddenly, the classroom was filled with the rustling of quills hastily scribbling on parchment. The potions class continued, but things didn't get any easier for the Gryffindor students. Snape paired them up and instructed them to brew a simple potion to cure boils. As Snape drifted around the classroom, his long black cloak trailing behind him, he observed their attempts to measure dried nettles and crush snake fangs. His criticism seemed almost inevitable. The only ones who escaped his ire were Malfoy, and the duo of Yvonne and Hermione. Malfoy was clearly Snape's favorite, and Yvonne, of course, did everything perfectly, leaving no room for Snape to find fault. Still, despite their flawless work, Snape barely glanced their way. Is it because we didn't make any improvements? Yvonne thought, not too bothered by Snape's lack of acknowledgement. He had to give credit where it was due, Snape's teaching style was impeccable. He broke down the potion-making process into bite-sized steps, so clear that it was practically impossible to mess up unless you weren't paying attention. As Snape himself had put it, as long as you're not completely dim-witted, you should be able to brew this potion. However, if a student managed to go beyond the instructions and improve the process, Snape wasn't one to withhold praise. He wasn't the kind of teacher who forced students to rigidly follow his methods. Learn and apply, and draw inferences from one example. Snape himself had mastered his craft this way. Ditot. Szzz. Suddenly, a puff of acidic green smoke billowed out of the cauldron in the underground classroom, followed by a loud hissing sound. Yvonne turned his head and saw that Neville, partnered with Harry, had managed to melt their cauldron into a lopsided, misshapen mess. The potion inside began spilling out onto the stone floor, burning holes in the shoes of several students nearby. Within seconds, the entire class had scrambled onto their stools, trying to avoid the spreading liquid as the cauldron tipped over and the potion splashed around. Idiot! Snape roared, stepping forward and preparing to wave his wand, but before he could act, there was a soft turjo. In an instant, all traces of the potion vanished from the floor. Snape froze for a moment, then turned to see Yvonne putting away his wand. He seemed to consider offering praise, but bit back the words before they escaped. I think you probably added the crushed snake fangs without removing the cauldron from the fire, didn't you? Yvonne asked calmly. Ah. Yeah. Neville flinched, grateful for Ivan's intervention, knowing he had just avoided a trip to the hospital wing. Unlike in the original timeline. However, even though Neville was saved from immediate disaster, Harry wasn't as lucky. Potter, Snape snapped, turning his ire towards him, why didn't you tell him not to add the crushed fangs? Snape, do you think it's fine just because he made a mistake? Gryffindor loses a point because of you. Harry was completely baffled, with a look that said, who am I? Where am I? What did I do wrong? Don't argue. Seeing that Harry was about to protest, Ronald gave him a swift kick under the table. I heard Snape's especially unreasonable. Frustrated, Harry could only glare at Snape, but it didn't matter, Snape didn't need a reason to target him. Dissatisfied with the professor's warning, Gryffindor loses another point because of you. This point deduction felt like Snape was just flexing his authority. At that moment, Harry really wanted to strangle Snape, completely bewildered by how unfair and unreasonable this professor was. Slytherin from the head of house down to the students really seemed like a bad lot. See. On the other side, Yvonne and Hermione had calmly finished brewing the potion that Snape had assigned. Yvonne leaned over and said, "Don't get involved. You'll just get yourself in trouble." But Hermione still wanted to know, why? Why was Snape so determined to pick on Harry? Was there some deep-rooted grudge? It's a long story. Yvonne smiled slightly, I'll explain it to you in detail later when we have time. Professor. Yvonne raised his hand, we've finished brewing the potion. The finished product made by Yvonne and Hermione was excellent, and even Snape couldn't find any faults with it. However, Snape did not award them any extra points. It seems that sometimes, fame isn't completely without merit. Snape remarked coldly, at least you and Miss Know-It-All have followed the rules properly. This kind of biased treatment made Hermione fume with anger. She had never encountered such an infuriating teacher before. If it weren't for Ivan's presence, Hermione might have earned the first distinction of talking back to a professor during her Hogwarts career. Thank you, Yvonne. Neville, who was walking to the cafeteria with them, thanked Yvonne on the way. If Yvonne hadn't stepped in when he did, Neville felt sure he would have been doused in the potion that could melt through the floor. A trip to the school hospital would have been unavoidable. Neville, potions class is definitely a bit challenging for you, Yvonne acknowledged sympathetically. Yvonne told the truth, your memory is so bad that it's easy for you to forget the steps of potion making and mix things up. Yvonne really had no way to fix this entirely. The only solution he could think of was to let Neville take turns teaming up with him and Hermione during future potions classes. With 2 top students guiding Neville step by step, there was hope for improvement. If you lack talent, you can make up for it with hard work. It's said that practice makes perfect, and Ivan's teaching approach for Neville was simple: practice. Practice until it becomes second nature, forming a conditioned reflex. I understand, Neville said obediently. He knew Yvonne was trying to help him, and he cherished the opportunity. After lunch, Yvonne and Hermione were heading to the library to return some books and borrow new ones. Yvonne, they heard Harry call out. He was with Ronald. Hagrid invited me to his cabin. Do you want to come along and check it out? Hagrid. Hermione raised an eyebrow. Because of Ivan's influence, Hermione's relationship with Harry and Ronald was just average. They didn't have much in common, and her first impression of Hagrid was simply that of a giant she saw when they arrived off the train. Yes, Harry confirmed. Hagrid lives on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. He invited me for afternoon tea. Thanks, Yvonne replied. He didn't know why Harry had invited him, but the gesture seemed genuine. Through his magical perception, Yvonne could clearly sense the emotional fluctuations of those around him, especially their feelings toward him. For example, Dumbledore came across as a kind old man, filled with warmth and care for his students, while Hermione's emotions were filled with admiration and a sense of attachment. Ron and most of the other students felt a mix of envy, a bit of jealousy, and a touch of awe toward Yvonne. As for Harry Potter, Harry did envy Yvonne, but there was no hint of jealousy, only curiosity and gratitude. Yvonne could tell that Harry genuinely wanted to be friends with him. Pure and kind-hearted, as expected from the hero of a fairy tale, Yvonne thought, secretly giving Harry a good evaluation. He then smiled and accepted the invitation. It would be my pleasure. Also, does Hagrid have a limit on the number of people who can visit? I mean. Yvonne gestured toward Hermione, who looked eager and curious. Of course. Harry said enthusiastically. I think Hagrid would be happy to welcome the smartest young wizards and witches at Hogwarts. Having left the Dursleys behind, Harry had learned to be more tactful in his speech. Words are an art. Calling Hermione the smartest young witch made her beam with pride. Especially considering that it came from Harry Potter, the famed savior of the wizarding world. Hermione may not have liked Ronald much, but she had a good impression of Harry. If Ronald weren't around, Hermione would gladly welcome Harry into their circle. Simply put, in her mind, Ronald, step aside. Stay away from my Yvonne. Chapter 54 Snape loved my. Soon, it was 5 minutes to 3 in the afternoon, and the 4 of them left the castle, making their way across the grounds to Hagrid's house. Hagrid lived in a small wooden hut on the edge of the Forbidden Forest, with a crossbow and a pair of large rubber boots sitting outside the front door. When Harry knocked, they heard some scuffling inside, followed by a few deep barks, and then Hagrid's booming voice. Back, Fang, back! Hagrid opened the door just a crack, his large, bearded face peeking through. He was surprised to see 4 young wizards standing at his doorstep, but as soon as he realized Harry had made friends, his face lit up with a warm smile of relief. Give me a section. Back, Fang! He let the 4 of them in while wrestling with the collar of an enormous black hound. The cabin consisted of just one room. Hams and pheasants hung from the ceiling, a copper kettle was steaming away on a fire in the hearth, and there was a large bed in one corner, covered with a patchwork quilt. Make yourselves at home, Hagrid said, finally releasing Fang. Fang, the gigantic dog, immediately bounded over to Ronald and began licking his ear. Like Hagrid, Fang was clearly not as fierce as it looked. This is Ronald, Harry introduced Hagrid to his first friend at Hogwarts. Ahm. You can call me Ron, Ron Weasley. Another Weasley brother? Right? That red hair is hard to miss, you know. Hagrid said, glancing at Ronald's freckled face. I spent almost half of my life chasing those twin brothers out of the Forbidden Forest. Hermione, on the other hand, was very composed. She didn't mind the clutter in Hagrid's hut and sat down naturally on the round stool Hagrid had prepared for her, waiting patiently as Hagrid bustled around, bringing out rock cakes and tea. Oh, a cute little witch, Hagrid said with a laugh. No need to be so formal. This isn't Professor McGonagall's classroom. Relax, Hermione, Yvonne added, looking around Hagrid's hut. His eyes swept over the various objects haphazardly piled up, giving the place the feel of an organized chaos. Aren't you curious about what's in the Forbidden Forest? Hagrid is an expert. No one at Hogwarts knows the Forbidden Forest better than he does. Haha. Hagrid chuckled, clearly pleased. I remember you. The little guy who could cast his own spells right after entering, no, even before entering school. I've never seen a young wizard as talented as you. Yvonne accepted the compliment with a nod. He glanced around the room again and asked, Hagrid, how do you manage all of this? I mean, these things. Everyone followed Ivan's gaze, but Harry and Ronald both looked as puzzled as ever. Hermione was equally confused, only seeing what looked like a room full of junk. You all. Yvonne sighed, shaking his head slightly. He sat down next to Hermione and picked up the milk tea Hagrid had prepared. The moment Yvonne had entered Hagrid's hut, he had felt the faint fluctuations of magic in the air. Casually using his magic eye, he had quickly scanned the room. What he found was astonishing: a room packed full of precious magical materials. It wasn't just the ordinary trinkets everyone else saw. The animal skin used as a carpet, for example, came from a unicorn. For context, unicorn tail hair alone was worth some valuable galleons. While the carpet wasn't entirely made of unicorn tail hair, its value in alchemical terms was immense. To put it simply, with just the materials lying around this hut, Hagrid could easily be considered one of the wealthiest individuals at Hogwarts. See something you like, little Yvonne? Hagrid beamed, pleased that Yvonne had noticed what the others hadn't. He began enthusiastically sharing stories about his love for magical creatures and the materials they provided. Hagrid even offered, with a grin, to let Yvonne use anything in the room that caught his eye. Naturally, Yvonne politely declined. The items were indeed valuable, but Yvonne knew better than to accept them without earning them. As the saying goes, repaying favors is one of the hardest things to do. Besides, Yvonne didn't need these rare magical materials at the moment. That's a pity, Hagrid said with a shrug, clearly not too concerned. Since Yvonne had politely refused, he didn't push further. For the rest of the visit, Hagrid proudly promoted his special rock cakes to the group while listening to their stories about their first week at Hogwarts. Each of them had encountered plenty of new and exciting things, given their fresh arrival at the school. Harry decided to bring up Snape's class, sharing his less than pleasant experience. Hagrid, like Ron, quickly reassured him. Don't worry about Snape, Harry. He doesn't really like anyone, to be honest. But it seems like he really hates me, Harry muttered. Nonsense. Hagrid replied firmly. Why would he hate you? But Harry couldn't shake the feeling that Hagrid was deliberately avoiding his gaze when he said that. Before Harry could press further, Hagrid quickly shifted the conversation toward Ron. How's your brother Charlie doing? He asked. I like him a lot, he's great with animals. Crack. Yvonne struggled with the rock cake for a while, quickly realizing that it was definitely not suitable as food. It was incredibly hard, almost impossible to chew, and even soaking it in tea didn't help. What was Hagrid's purpose in making this? Yvonne wondered. This thing was hard enough to be used for building walls. Yvonne, Hermione whispered, her eyes pleading for help as she glanced at the uneaten rock cake in her hands. Noticing that Hagrid's attention was fully focused on his conversation with Ronald, Yvonne discreetly moved his fingers. In the next moment, the rock cakes in both his and Hermione's hands shrank in size. Then, with the help of a floating charm, they quickly disappeared into Ivan's pocket. Harry, seeing this, looked at Yvonne with a desperate expression, his emerald eyes silently begging for the same relief. Yvonne couldn't help but smile. With another flick of his fingers, Harry's rock cake vanished as well. Ronald, too engrossed in talking about his brother Charlie, didn't notice any of the little movements happening around him. So, in the end, he was the only one still dealing with the rock cake, fully immersed in his world. Oh! Hagrid exclaimed suddenly, noticing the now empty plate. You actually finished them all. He was overjoyed. For so many years, no one had ever shown as much enthusiasm for his rock cakes as this group seemed to. What? Ronald was completely confused, unsure of what had just happened. In just a few moments, Yvonne and the others had somehow managed to finish off 3 plates of rock cakes. I knew it. I knew someone would like them. Hagrid's eyes gleamed with joy, as though he had finally found someone who shared his love for his infamous rock cakes. "You must still be hungry, right? I'll get more for you." The way Hagrid said it, it seemed like he was ready to stuff all the remaining rock cakes down their throats. Sensing the impending doom, Yvonne, Hermione, and Harry immediately chimed in together, "Ah! No, no, we're full." "Really?" Hagrid seemed a bit disappointed but determined to be a good host. He was convinced that if he had nothing else, at least he had plenty of rock cakes to share. "Really?" Harry added quickly. "I really can't eat another bite." Even Hermione, who usually valued honesty, nodded along this time. She lied. "But when it comes to rock cakes, if you don't lie, do you really want to end up having to eat them?" Hagrid, what's this? To steer the conversation away from the dreaded rock cakes, Harry spotted a small piece of paper tucked under the teapot warmer. It was a report cut from the Daily Prophet. Latest report on Gringotts break-in. Investigations into the July 31st break-in at Gringotts are still ongoing, and it is now widely believed to be the work of an unknown dark wizard. The goblins at Gringotts reiterated today that nothing was stolen and that the underground vault searched by the intruder had, in fact, been emptied earlier that day. A Gringotts goblin spokesperson said this afternoon, "We have no information on what was in the vault, and it is best not to interfere in this matter." Harry remembered Ron mentioning the break-in on the train, but he hadn't said anything about the exact date. "Hagrid!" Harry exclaimed. "The day of the Gringotts break-in was my birthday. We were probably there when it happened." Yvonne already knew that this break-in was Voldemort's attempt to steal the Philosopher's Stone. He calmly sipped his milk tea, showing no interest in the matter. Hermione noticed Ivan's reaction. Being quite familiar with his habits by now, the little witch quickly realized that there was more to this report than it seemed. She sat quietly, not saying a word. "Oh, it was just a little thing," Hagrid muttered dismissively, clearly trying to avoid discussing anything related to the Philosopher's Stone. After leaving Hagrid's cabin, the four of them walked back to the castle for dinner, their pockets stuffed with rock cakes. Yet, out of politeness, they were too embarrassed to refuse. Along the way, Harry remained unusually quiet. He was still deep in thought about the Gringotts break-in. Additionally, he had a nagging feeling that Hagrid knew something about Snape but was unwilling to share it for some reason. "Yvonne." Suddenly, Harry noticed Yvonne walking ahead, holding hands with Hermione. At that moment, Harry felt like he had found the key to solving the mystery. Yes, that's it. He couldn't figure things out because he wasn't smart enough, he had always known that. But Yvonne and Hermione, they were recognized as the smartest first-year wizards at Hogwarts. Harry never considered himself particularly talented in academics. Not understanding some difficult problems and puzzling situations was perfectly normal for him. And if you don't understand something, you ask. With two little wizards who seemed to know everything walking right in front of him, why hesitate? "What's wrong, Harry?" Yvonne turned around with a smile. He already knew that Harry had doubts in his heart. However, there were some things that weren't suitable for him to talk about openly. Harry didn't hide his thoughts and told the group about his suspicions, including the fact that Hagrid had gone to the 713 vault at Gringotts to retrieve something on the same day as the break-in. "This smells like trouble." Hermione's excellent sixth sense picked up on the potential danger. She was brave and always eager to prove that she was just as capable as any other wizard or witch. But this particular situation involved Dumbledore, and she didn't feel confident dealing with something that significant. "So, Harry." Yvonne could see that Harry truly trusted him and genuinely considered them friends. "What do you want to know?" Yvonne asked with a knowing smile. Harry looked at Ivan's mysterious grin, a bit taken aback. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. He wanted to ask what had been in the vault, why someone would attempt to steal it, and if it was still safe now. But after a moment's thought, he wondered what did any of this really have to do with him? After being pointed out by Yvonne, Harry immediately realized that he wasn't in a position to get involved with something as significant as the Gringotts break-in. "I want to know, why is Snape targeting me so much?" Harry asked. Compared to the mystery of the 713 vault, this issue felt more personal and pressing. "Aha!" Yvonne nodded slightly, satisfied with Harry's sense of self-awareness. According to Ivan's plan, the little wizards of Hogwarts were essential talent reserves and loyal future allies, people he could genuinely build connections with. Hermione was, of course, the future Minister of Magic in his eyes. Neville, the sword-wielding Gryffindor and future professor of herbology at Hogwarts, had considerable potential too. Then there was Harry, and Luna, who had yet to enroll. Especially Harry Potter, he undoubtedly had the potential to stand on his own. If you asked who among these little wizards could lead a charge for Yvonne in the future and fire the first shot, it had to be Harry. After all, no young wizard could go toe-to-toe with Voldemort in their 4th year and ultimately kill the most terrifying dark wizard in England by their 7th year. Whether it was plot armor or Dumbledore's long-term schemes, these events were bound to happen. But the fact that Harry could accomplish all of this? It proved his talent beyond doubt. Hermione was Ivan's trusted think tank, and Harry was a force to be reckoned with. Now was the time when Harry and Hermione were still in their most impressionable and uncertain phase. Yvonne could make his move and bring Harry into his fold. Well, Hermione was already on board. Next up, it was Harry's turn. I do know something, Yvonne said with a mischievous wink at Harry. You see, I'm a seer, a natural prophet, and I can glimpse fragments of the future. But that's not the whole story. Actually, it's not just the future. Hearing this, Harry's eyes lit up with curiosity. Yvonne, can you see the past? Exactly. Yvonne nodded. Though it's just brief fragments, and it usually has to be something significant, like a key moment in someone's life, a turning point, if you will. But I have seen some very interesting things. Yvonne wasn't deceiving Harry, he was telling the truth. Ever since his soul attribute had surpassed 5 points, his control over prophecy had become more fluid. He could now glimpse the past and future of anyone as needed. He could also foresee crises he might encounter in the future or even discover ways to avoid misfortune, almost like making a wish. Fate is an immensely terrifying force in this world. Yvonne had previously said that the outcomes of a prophecy would inevitably happen and couldn't be changed. However, just because it couldn't be changed didn't mean it couldn't be avoided. For example, if Yvonne foresaw that Harry would fall down the magical stairs, he couldn't stop the event from happening, it was destined. But falling down was just the process. What came afterward, the result, and even the cause of the fall were all unclear. This gave Yvonne a lot of room to work with. For instance, he could let Harry intentionally trip on the stairs to fulfill the prophecy. Or, after Harry fell, Yvonne could cast a levitation charm to catch him, altering the outcome. By supplementing the cause and effect, Yvonne could exploit the loopholes of the prophecy, turning what seemed like a bad situation into a farce or minor inconvenience. The past is set in stone, but the future, that can still be influenced. Yvonne didn't worry about whether Harry fully understood his explanation, he simply shared his insights into prophecy and fate. Yvonne, what did you see? Harry asked eagerly. Snape once knew a girl, Yvonne revealed. Before coming to Hogwarts, they were best friends. Yvonne simply told Harry what he had seen, without revealing the identity of the girl. Later, Snape was sorted into Slytherin, and the girl went to Gryffindor. Naturally, their relationship grew distant. The 3 kids listened intently, their curiosity about the girl's identity growing with each word. Despite their age, they quickly picked up on the implications of Snape's backstory. And then what happened? They were fascinated. Snape, the cold and harsh professor, actually had someone he cared about? Yvonne paused for a moment, then continued, the girl eventually ended up with someone else and had a child with him. By now, the hint was more than obvious. Snape liked my mum? Harry asked in confusion. He had just been looking to understand why Snape disliked him so much, but now it seemed he had stumbled upon a far bigger revelation, one about his own mother. WTF? But why? Hermione furrowed her brow. If Snape liked Harry's mother, why would he be so horrible to Harry? Is it because of love turning into hate? Yvonne smiled lightly, feeling that he'd already said more than enough. Although he could directly use glass, crystal balls and other reflective objects to show the predicted scenes, so that the 3 little ones could see what happened more directly. But it was about Snape's privacy. Yvonne would not do such a ridiculous thing without the consent of the person concerned. Joking was one thing, and Harry did have the right to know. So Yvonne told Harry about Lily. But Snape's dark history, such as being almost bitten by Lupin and turned into a werewolf, being bullied by the 4 people who took the initiative to cause trouble with the hanging bell, and finally hugging Lily's body, vowed to protect Harry, and so on. Chapter 55 Voldemort was killed by the plot. I can only say that Snape didn't hate you because of your mother. On the contrary, he cares about you because he loved your mother, Yvonne said. Snape notices you, especially your eyes. They're exactly like hers. Harry felt a bit speechless. Upon thinking it over, he realized that Snape's attitude towards him might indeed fit what Yvonne was saying. It seemed like Snape was targeting him, but in reality, it was a different kind of attention, something that made more sense now. After understanding that Snape's treatment wasn't due to Harry's fame as the boy who lived, but rather because of his connection to his mother, Harry could accept it more easily. Though, it was still very weird that Snape, of all people, had feelings for his mother. Gulp. Wait, something doesn't add up here, Hermione quickly pointed out. If Snape liked Harry's mother, why would he treat Harry so badly? Good question, Yvonne said with a shrug and a smirk. If Harry were a girl, I guarantee Snape wouldn't have this attitude. Suddenly, Hermione understood. It's because of Harry's father, isn't it? My father. Harry, having never known his parents personally, only had a vague sense of who they were. Isn't it obvious? Hermione explained. Yvonne said Snape loves your mother, but he only talked about your eyes being like hers. What about the rest of you? Yes, what about the rest? Only Harry's eyes resembled his mother's, so naturally, the rest of his features must remind Snape of his father. Is that true? Harry's eyes widened, looking at Yvonne for some confirmation. Their relationship wasn't very good, or to put it bluntly, it was terrible, Yvonne said directly. When Snape looks at you, he sees your father. Just because of that? Harry was shocked. He had never known the full story, and now he just wanted to call Snape unreasonable. In Harry's view, his parents were a happy couple, and for Snape to take out his issues on him just because of that seemed insane. Everything has a cause and effect, Yvonne said, feeling he had shared enough for now. But the result wasn't what he expected. Harry, far from understanding, now disliked Snape even more. Oops. Knowing this backstory only made Harry feel more determined to oppose Snape. In his mind, Snape was not only a bitter old man but also someone who had held feelings for his mother, and for that, Harry felt it was now his duty to defend his father's honor. Seeing Harry's growing desire to challenge Snape, Yvonne smiled helplessly. Yvonne tried to say a few good words in Snape's defense, attempting to smooth things over. He just doesn't like you, Harry. There's no deeper reason behind it. In this whole school, anyone can mess with you, but Snape won't actually hurt you, Yvonne added, hoping Harry would understand. I get it, Harry replied. Even though he disliked Snape, he didn't consider him a true enemy, more like someone he was perpetually at odds with. It wasn't just hatred, there were complicated feelings mixed in as well. After finding out that Snape had loved his mother, Harry couldn't help but view him differently. Snape now saw in Harry both the woman he loved and the man who had stolen her away. The result was an awkward mix of love, hate, and contempt. This gave Harry the strange feeling that he wasn't being targeted simply as himself. Unlike the Dursleys' outright hostility, Snape's treatment of him was more like constant nitpicking. Yet beneath the harshness, there seemed to be something else, a kind of twisted care. Harry, always perceptive, picked up on these subtle undertones, leaving him feeling even more conflicted. In the days that followed, whenever Harry encountered Snape, he couldn't help but give him strange looks, as if trying to figure out the enigma that was Snape. Well, targeting? Devaluing? Deducting points? Haha, it's like a kid being denied candy, Harry joked. Snape's just like a shadow of my dad, no wonder he holds a grudge. He added, smirking slightly to himself. However, Harry's constant glances toward Snape didn't go unnoticed. The potions master, sharp as ever, quickly sensed that something was off. His instincts told him that Harry had learned something Snape didn't want him to know. This discovery left Snape deeply unsettled and furious. He wasn't sure who had been gossiping, but he knew it had to be someone close to Harry. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Snape confronted Harry, trying to pry information from him. Of course, Harry wouldn't betray his friends. He remained tight-lipped, unwilling to reveal anything. But how could a child, however determined, stand up to Snape, the master of deception, Legilimens, and one of the sharpest minds in the wizarding world? Within minutes, Snape had picked up enough from Harry's surface thoughts to piece together the truth. Yvonne Ambrosius. Snape didn't need to delve deeply into Harry's mind. Just as Yvonne had predicted, Snape would never harm the children of the woman he once loved. However, Harry's unguarded thoughts were enough for Snape to catch a name. Yvonne. That was the answer he had been looking for. How does he know this? Snape wondered, his mind racing. After all, Yvonne was far too young to know about his past with Lily. A little wizard who grew up in the Muggle world, with no access to magical knowledge, somehow knew such a closely guarded secret. Exclude all impossibilities, and whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. That's right, Dumbledore. Snape thought furiously, you old fool, you broke your promise. How dare you betray me? He clenched his fists. Of course, I shouldn't have trusted that insidious, cunning, and manipulative old bee. Exposing my past? I can't let this slide. Severus. That same evening, Dumbledore was peacefully teaching Yvonne advanced magic in his office when, suddenly, the door burst open. In stormed Snape, eyes blazing with anger. His voice dripped with sarcasm as he spat, "Wow, look at this, our great and noble white wizard, once again sharing other people's secrets without a care." Both Dumbledore and Yvonne exchanged a puzzled glance. Dumbledore, clearly confused, raised an eyebrow at Snape's sudden outburst. However, as wise as ever, Dumbledore's instincts quickly kicked in. He glanced toward Yvonne, silently asking for an explanation. "It seems that Mr. Ambrosius has stirred up a bit of trouble," Dumbledore said, with a twinkle in his eye, though his tone remained light. After spending some time with Yvonne, Dumbledore had come to understand his character well enough to know that he never meant any harm. He winked playfully at Yvonne, signaling that it was time for him to resolve this misunderstanding with Snape before things escalated further. Cough. Yvonne cleared his throat, feeling slightly guilty. He realized that perhaps talking behind someone's back and revealing their past wasn't the most considerate thing to do. "Sorry, Professor." Yvonne explained everything he had told Harry, keeping it straightforward. "That's all you said?" Snape asked, eyeing Yvonne carefully. After hearing Ivan's explanation, Snape secretly let out a breath of relief. Thankfully, Yvonne had some sense of discretion and hadn't shared all the intimate details of his past. "Yes," Yvonne confirmed, nodding. "I think Harry, as the person involved, deserves to know at least that much." Snape couldn't really find fault in Ivan's reasoning. He begrudgingly realized that Yvonne had actually shown some restraint. After all, Yvonne was Harry's friend, and being cautious with how much he revealed was a thoughtful decision on his part. If it had been another hot-headed young wizard eager to boast or gossip, Snape's personal history could have easily become public knowledge by now. Prophecy. To know the past and predict the future. Snape realized he had seriously underestimated Ivan's talent. This young wizard was terrifying. Even the Dark Lord hadn't shown such abilities when he first entered school. "All right, Severus," Dumbledore interjected gently, directing a few calming words toward Yvonne, reminding him not to reveal too much. "Yvonne will keep your secrets safe." "No." Snape finally snapped back to reality, his gaze narrowing at Yvonne. "How much do you really know?" At that moment, Snape grasped the true gravity of Ivan's words. His ability to know the past wasn't just a figure of speech. This kid, could it be? "As you're probably thinking, Professor," Yvonne replied calmly, "I can see the past, and the future. Though it's often fragmented and incomplete, I do know a great deal." Good grief, Snape thought. Ivan's abilities were absolutely terrifying. The secrets Snape had spent years trying to bury suddenly felt exposed, laid bare in front of Yvonne as if peeled away like layers from an onion. "Absolutely. Tell anyone, and you will regret it." Snape stood inches from Yvonne, barely restraining himself from lashing out. His voice was tense, his teeth gritted in frustration. Okay, Professor, I promise," Yvonne replied with a calm smile, as if the whole situation was merely a friendly negotiation. He wasn't at all embarrassed about the fact that he'd been speaking behind Snape's back. Knowing something was one thing, but sharing it recklessly was another. "I hope you can give me a little assistance, Professor," Yvonne added, with a sly smile. "Assistance?" Snape repeated, momentarily caught off guard. His lips twitched as he quickly understood what Yvonne meant. It wasn't assistance, this was a threat, plain and simple. Ivan's unspoken message was clear: "Professor, you don't want Harry to find out everything about the past, do you?" "What do you want?" Snape demanded, incredulous that a first-year student would dare to threaten him, and in front of Dumbledore, no less. Dumbledore, the greatest white wizard in the world, and Snape, the formidable head of Slytherin, both now faced a young wizard who had just started his Hogwarts education but was already playing games most wouldn't dare. In the wizarding world, it would not be an exaggeration to say that Dumbledore stands at the pinnacle of power. As for Snape, he was the Dark Lord's most trusted confidant, the White Wizard's right-hand man, and a master of double-dealing, essentially the wizarding world's ultimate undercover agent in Harry Potter's infernal affairs. And yet, you dare to threaten me? Clearly, Yvonne had no idea what it meant to tempt fate. Snape's gaze shot to Dumbledore, eyes practically screaming, "Are you seriously going to let this happen?" But Dumbledore, in his usual fashion of strategic absent-mindedness, pretended not to notice. With an almost childlike delight, he opened the sugar jar on his desk, grabbed a cockroach cluster, and began munching away, completely unfazed. I do love this flavor," he murmured between bites. Snape's eye twitched. He resisted the very strong urge to hex both the headmaster and Yvonne on the spot. What happened to keeping secrets? And Dumbledore really acting like this was no big deal? Meanwhile, Yvonne had just casually dropped Snape's secrets like he was reading a plot summary. "Fine," Snape growled. "I want to ask the professor to teach me how to duel wizards," Yvonne said suddenly, breaking Snape's train of thought. "What did you say?" Snape blinked, completely thrown off by the unexpected request. "What's going on? Is my dark magic not sinister enough, or are you, Yvonne, just too full of yourself?" Snape's mind reeled. A first-year wizard, barely half a month into school, with only a month of experience with a wand, and he wants to duel me. Are you serious? Snape couldn't find the right words to express his bewilderment. Was this bravery or sheer stupidity? "Yes," Yvonne replied confidently, glancing at Dumbledore, who sat quietly beside them. Yvonne had initially considered asking Dumbledore for instruction. However, his instincts told him he was far from being able to challenge the legendary headmaster. He couldn't forget the duel scene from Fantastic Beasts 3, where a much younger Dumbledore effortlessly overpowered Credence, as if disciplining a child. Compared to Credence, who was in his 20s, Yvonne estimated that his own magic power might be on a similar level. And with the advantage of wielding the Phoenix wand, Yvonne felt he might even surpass Credence. But going up against Dumbledore, who had spent 60 or 70 years honing his magical abilities and now stood at the pinnacle of wizardry, was a different matter entirely. Yvonne knew he was simply no match for him, yet. "Originally, I should have been the one to teach him how to duel," Dumbledore finally intervened, just as Snape was about to reject Ivan's request. "What?" Snape blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Dumbledore? The greatest wizard of the age, someone even he who must not be named feared." Snape had spent years alongside Dumbledore, and despite his own impressive magical skills, he knew he could never fully grasp Dumbledore's depth of power. As for anyone challenging Dumbledore one-on-one? Ridiculous. "Please, Severus," Dumbledore said kindly. His plan was simple, to help Yvonne better control his Obscurus by teaching him through a wizard duel. Dumbledore had taken quite the interest in Yvonne, treating him almost like a favored pupil. It reminded Dumbledore of the days when he taught Transfiguration and even substituted in defense against the dark arts back when his life was filled with teaching bright young minds. But Snape? Snape felt a sharp pang in his temple. This was absurd. "Do you even realize what you're asking?" Snape shot a sharp glance at Dumbledore. It was bad enough that Yvonne had just threatened him a moment ago, but now the boy expected him to teach him how to duel? This was some twisted joke, surely. Snape even wondered if Dumbledore had lost his grip on reality, or worse come down with actual Alzheimer's. "All right, fine," Snape sighed in resignation, his voice cold and calculated. He fixed his intense gaze on Yvonne, enunciating each word slowly and deliberately. "But don't expect me to go easy on you." And with those words, Snape had obviously agreed. "Don't worry, Yvonne, will keep my mouth shut," Yvonne said with a slight smile. He had only been testing the waters, trying to see if he could reach Snape through Harry. Unexpectedly, it actually worked. "Just as I thought," Yvonne mused, "Harry is the key to reaching Snape." There was no doubt that Snape was a valuable asset. He was a master of potions, an expert in dark magic, and formidable in both practical combat and mental abilities. It would be a tragedy to let someone like him die as he did in the original timeline, falling to Nagini's fangs. If it was within Ivan's power, he would gladly lend a hand and change that fate. Now, let's return to our earlier discussion. After Snape had left, only Ivan and Dumbledore remained in the headmaster's office. "All right, Professor," Ivan replied calmly, sitting before Dumbledore. "You understand better than anyone just how powerful the force of fate truly is." Before Snape had arrived, Dumbledore had been seeking Ivan's insight into the prophecy. Dumbledore wanted to uncover the secret behind Voldemort's immortality. "I can only tell you that the prophecy is true," Ivan began, referring to the prophecy that linked Harry and Voldemort. "One must die at the hands of the other, and only one can survive." The conclusion had been decided, but the path to that end was still theirs to shape. Was Voldemort powerful? Many people assumed he was weak simply because his nemesis was a young wizard still in school. But the truth was that Voldemort was terrifyingly strong. Remember, Grindelwald was only defeated by Dumbledore, yet Voldemort was destined to die in the narrative. His death had too many coincidental elements. With 7 Horcruxes, Voldemort had made himself nearly invincible. No ordinary wizard, not even Dumbledore, could destroy him completely. If it hadn't been for Harry and the prophecy leading to Voldemort's inevitable defeat, who in the entire wizarding world could have ended him? In simple terms, with the Horcruxes, Voldemort could afford to lose repeatedly, but his opponents had to win every single time. Also, the prophecy is not as omnipotent as you might think, Ivan added. Before Snape had interrupted, Dumbledore had been asking Ivan whether divination or a glimpse into the past could help them discover Voldemort's secret to immortality. Of course, Ivan already knew that Voldemort's secret lay in the Horcruxes. But the problem is that there are certain limitations to divining the past. For example, when Ivan attempted to look into the pasts of Voldemort and Dumbledore, there were some things he simply could not see. Divination and prophecy are magical in nature. And like all magic, there are means to resist or obscure them. The gifts of fate seem to come without consequence, but in truth, the price is often hidden. Who really killed Ariana? Why did Voldemort survive, despite so many attempts to kill him? He created multiple Horcruxes. Where were they hidden? And there are other barriers too, targets protected by the Fidelius charm, certain forbidden magical knowledge. All of these remain shrouded, even to someone with Ivan's abilities. Even though Ivan knew the original plot from his world, there were still some things he couldn't reveal casually. "You're right," Dumbledore said thoughtfully, removing his glasses as he considered Ivan's words. "Voldemort, at this moment, may not seem like an immediate threat. His fate is sealed. However, if they interfere too much, and Voldemort somehow becomes aware of the workings of fate itself, that would be an enormous problem." Chapter 56 Flying Lesson. What does it mean to solve the mystery of fate? Voldemort, death is just the beginning. If Voldemort ever discovered how to break the cycle and escape the prophecy that tied him to death, the original prediction would be shattered. Should that happen, Voldemort's magical power would likely increase even further, potentially reaching 6 points. Ivan had previously asked Dumbledore how one could raise their magical power to that level, and Dumbledore's answer had been clear: solve your own destiny. Ivan speculated that by the end of the original story, Dumbledore, who had willingly embarked on what he called another great adventure, had transcended life and death, entering this higher realm. Good fortune and misfortune are intertwined. Voldemort's death is a fate, but it's also a test. Not just Voldemort, Grindelwald and Credence had their own tests as well. Ivan didn't know exactly what Grindelwald's was, but Credence's seemed clearer, breaking free from the curse of the Obscurus, transforming completely in both mind and body. "Good night, Professor." "Good night, little Ivan." After leaving the headmaster's office, Ivan returned to his dormitory. Neville had already fallen asleep. Meow. However, Yumi, noticing her master's return, jumped off the bed, landing lightly before leaping onto Ivan's trouser leg. "Shh, speak softly." "Don't wake Neville," Ivan whispered as he sat down with Yumi in his arms. He opened his system while gently petting the cat. Main task, 1. Description: you have learned the secret to breaking through to a legendary level, and now the full task is unlocked. Task requirements: refine a Philosopher's Stone by yourself. Task reward: 1 experience point, can be applied beyond legendary level. Here it comes. Ivan knew that the system would eventually present him with a way to reach the next level. But Philosopher's Stone. But this task was far beyond Ivan's current capabilities. For a first-year wizard, refining a Philosopher's Stone was simply unimaginable. The Philosopher's Stone is a legendary artifact in the wizarding world, representing the pinnacle of alchemy and the power of equivalent exchange. The only known wizard to have successfully created a Philosopher's Stone was Nicholas Flamel. With my current knowledge, it's impossible to complete this task. Ivan thought to himself. If I want to learn the formula for the Philosopher's Stone and the skills required to refine it, I can only seek out Nicholas Flamel. Fortunately, this task had no time limit. As long as Ivan could complete it, even if it took a few years or more than a decade, he would still earn the experience point. Yet, it seems I'll need to strengthen my study of alchemy. Ivan concluded. The emergence of the main task had opened up a new direction for Ivan. In addition to studying spells, he now had a new academic pursuit. In the following days, Ivan found many books on alchemy in the Hogwarts library. Hermione showed some talent in this area, but she had too much on her plate at the moment. Ivan suggested that she not spend too much time on alchemy right now. The little witch accepted Ivan's advice and poured all her energy into learning spells instead. As for Neville, he was still often lost in thought. The boy followed Ivan and Hermione around daily and would occasionally play with Harry and Ron when they stopped by. One day, Ivan and Hermione entered the Great Hall and noticed that the other young wizards seemed particularly excited. Why do they all seem to be in a sugar rush? After asking around, they learned that they had flying class today. Almost a month after the start of term, Hogwarts was finally holding its first flying lesson. As everyone knows, entertainment activities for kids in the wizarding world were quite limited. They entered Hogwarts at the age of 11, and before that, they had almost always stayed at home. Due to the sparse population, wizard families are far apart, and many young wizards are quite isolated before starting school. Ivan wasn't particularly interested in Quidditch. Of course, he didn't dislike Quidditch. It just didn't appeal to him, as it didn't help improve his magical skills. What bad luck, Harry said, sitting across from Ivan with a frustrated expression. I've got flying lessons with Slytherin. I can't imagine how much Malfoy would laugh at me if I make a fool of myself. It's not certain that you'll make a fool of yourself, Ron chimed in, pouting. Malfoy's always bragging about how good he is at Quidditch, but I bet he's just making it up. As the flying class approached, some of the young wizards who had broomsticks at home and had played simple Quidditch games were boasting about their flying skills. Among them, Malfoy was the loudest. Not only was Harry anxious, but Ivan and Hermione also frequently became the targets of Malfoy's bragging. Both Ivan and Hermione came from Muggle families and had never touched a flying broomstick in their lives. Malfoy felt this made him superior, and he was determined to show off in front of them. In the Great Hall, Malfoy loudly bragged about his flying prowess, telling numerous self-aggrandizing stories, each one culminating in him narrowly avoiding a Muggle helicopter. Hogwarts school rules make no sense at all, Malfoy complained. Why aren't first-year students allowed to join the school Quidditch team? It was as if he believed the school was missing out on a Quidditch genius like him who was born to fly. And this situation was not an isolated case. For example, our resident explosive saint, Seamus Finnegan, from the way he spoke, seemed to have spent most of his childhood flying around the countryside on a broomstick. Even Ronald, if anyone was willing to listen, would talk about the time he almost crashed into a hang glider while riding his brother Charlie's old broom. For a while, almost everyone from a wizarding family was chattering non-stop about Quidditch. Children's competitive spirit, Ivan thought with a smile. It was just a bunch of kids showing off. Even if someone's flying skills weren't great, being laughed at was just part of growing up. No one is perfect. Ivan already considered himself quite skilled, and it was normal to have a few areas where he wasn't as strong. However, the way Malfoy dragged Harry into his bragging rubbed Ivan the wrong way. After all, Ivan knew full well how good Harry's flying skills actually were. Hey, I'll leave the flying lesson to you, Harry, Ivan said with a confident grin. When the time comes, show Malfoy what you're made of. What? Harry was taken aback. Although Ivan's encouragement made him feel better, he really wasn't familiar with flying on a broom. Ivan, can I also do it? Neville asked hesitantly. Neville was very worried that he would fall off the flying broom. He had never ridden a flying broom in his life. His grandmother had never let him near one. Ivan felt that his grandmother was right. Even with his 2 feet firmly on the ground, Neville could always manage to create endless accidents. What would happen if he flew into the sky? Don't worry, Ivan comforted him. Even if you do fall, don't forget you still have me. I'll catch you. Thank you, Neville said, feeling slightly reassured. Yes, with Ivan around, even if something went wrong during the flying lesson, he could be sure of his safety. The surrounding students, upon hearing Ivan say this, cast grateful glances at him, their initial fear of flying fading significantly. It had to be admitted that after a month of getting to know him, Ivan's status among the first-year wizards had risen considerably. Gryffindor saw Ivan as their Lion King and leader. Ravenclaw admired Ivan's wisdom. Almost everyone had sought his help in magic or other school matters at some point. Hufflepuff appreciated Ivan's approachability and often shared food from the kitchens with him. Ivan also built close relationships with Hermione, Neville, Harry, and others, further strengthening the bond between the Gryffindor Lions and the Hufflepuff Badgers. As for Slytherin, no one knew who first discovered Ivan's surname. Ambrosius, a descendant of Merlin, from the Eternal family. Although Ivan had never publicly admitted it, and it was still just speculation, the mere possibility of such an illustrious background caused an uproar in Slytherin. There was no doubt that even the oldest pureblood families paled in comparison to the name Ambrosius. The little snakes dared not act recklessly in front of Ivan. Besides Ivan's undeniable abilities, Merlin's bloodline played a significant role in their perception. In their eyes, perhaps Ivan was a pureblood wizard who had been lost in the Muggle world. He was more noble than all of them, destined for greatness at the very pinnacle of pureblood society. Gryffindor? So what? Couldn't he just be an undercover agent? A pearl hidden among common stones. Understanding the heart of a sphinx wasn't something ordinary people could do. In short, Ivan was special. He wasn't operating on the same level as everyone else, he was a transcendent being with a cheat. Quidditch rules, flying essentials. Beside Ivan, Hermione was nervously reciting from Quidditch Through the Ages. The little witch was just as anxious as Neville. Don't worry, it's just flying. Ivan patted Hermione's head reassuringly. However, the little witch wasn't afraid of falling. Her real fear was that she might not be able to fly at all. It wasn't Hermione's fault, she had simply become too fascinated with Quidditch. Besides the first-year witches, Hermione's dorm room also housed upper-year students who had plenty to say about Quidditch. Over time, Hermione had developed an interest in the sport. Miss Know-It-All, who had always been strong in academics, didn't worry about falling off a broom. Instead, she dreamed of becoming a member of the Gryffindor Quidditch team, just like her senior students. Ivan knew Hermione's situation all too well. This girl's mental attributes were almost entirely focused on academics. When it came to reflexes and athletic ability, well, it was generous to say she was barely passing. Hermione playing Quidditch? Ivan was more concerned that the broom might accidentally fly her straight into one of the goals. Just have fun. Ivan chose not to say anything discouraging. In his mind, he was already preparing to comfort the little witch after she inevitably bumped into something. Suddenly, the cry of an owl echoed across the hall. Everyone looked up and saw that the package had arrived. Neville received a package from his grandmother. He excitedly opened it and found a glass ball the size of a yo-yo inside, swirling faintly with white mist. Is that a remembrall? Hermione immediately recognized it and explained to everyone, it tells you if you've forgotten something. As long as you hold it tightly, if it turns red. Ah! Before Hermione could finish her explanation, the remembrall in Neville's hand suddenly glowed bright red. It means you've forgotten something, she concluded. But I don't remember what I've forgotten at all, Neville said, trying hard to recall what it could be. At that moment, Draco Malfoy strolled past the Gryffindor table and snatched the remembrall from Neville's hand. Hey, everyone, look! Neville got himself a remembrall. Malfoy sneered. That's mine. Give it back, Malfoy. Neville was startled and quickly chased after him, trying desperately to retrieve the remembrall. Seeing this, Harry and Ron also stood up to help Neville. In no time, the hall erupted into chaos, with shouts and scrambling as students darted about. Ah, childhood! Ivan watched the commotion but didn't intervene. Malfoy was being mischievous as usual, and this wasn't the first time he'd picked on Neville. As long as it didn't get out of hand, Ivan didn't see the need to step in. All right, Draco. Swoosh. Seeing that Malfoy and Ronald were on the verge of starting a fight, Ivan calmly waved his hand, summoning the remembrall directly into his palm. Weasley, too, he added. No fighting in the hall. After that, Ivan handed the remembrall back to Neville. Upon seeing Ivan intervene, Malfoy reluctantly backed off, returning to stand between Goyle and Crabbe, not daring to escalate the situation. This was the authority Yvonne had established in front of Slytherin. If Yvonne wasn't present during a dispute, the students could argue or even fight. But once Yvonne stepped in, both the Gryffindors and Slytherins had to calm down and behave themselves. "Evil Malfoy," Ronald muttered under his breath. "Poor Weasley," Malfoy hissed back. The two continued their muttered insults, but Yvonne, used to such bickering, simply ignored them. It was nothing more than a verbal spat. As long as no punches were thrown, Yvonne didn't mind letting them vent their frustrations. That's fine. After a month, Yvonne had successfully established a sense of control over the first-year students. Across all four houses, aside from Hermione and Neville, Yvonne showed no particular favoritism and generally maintained a fair and equal attitude towards everyone. The professors were more than happy to see this happen. Professor McGonagall had also praised Yvonne for this, noting that ever since he had come to Hogwarts, the relationships between the four houses had become much more harmonious. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Yvonne and the other Gryffindor students gathered in the field near the entrance. The Slytherin students were already there, and next to them were more than 20 flying brooms, neatly laid out on the ground. The flying instructor, Madame Hooch, stood before them. She had short grey hair and sharp yellow eyes, like those of an eagle. "All right, what are you waiting for?" Madame Hooch said briskly. "Everyone stand next to a broom, quickly, quickly, let's get going." Under her direction, the young wizards hurriedly picked a broom each. "Extend your right hand over the broom handle," Madame Hooch commanded, pacing in front of the group. "Then say, 'Up.'" The brooms were all similar old and worn. Yvonne followed Madame Hooch's instructions, stretched out his hand over his broom, and said, "Up." Swoop. At once, his broom leaped into his hand as if it were alive. This drew the attention of several students. But after realizing it was Yvonne, everyone quickly lost interest. "Yvonne? Well, of course. That figures." This is what the young wizards from both Gryffindor and Slytherin thought at the time. They were already accustomed to Ivan's outstanding performance. Yvonne grasped the flying broom in his hand. He hadn't used magic or cast any spells, he had simply shouted, "Up." Telepathy transmission, hey. Yvonne thought. Many magical items in the wizarding world had a certain degree of self-awareness. This was due to the fact that when wizards crafted magical items, their thoughts and intentions were imbued into the object via magic. Flying brooms, memory balls, and even magical portraits. Yvonne was no longer surprised by their reactions. However, he was pleased that his flying talent was immediately acknowledged by the broom. A few minutes later, Harry's broom followed suit, jumping into his hand just like Ivan's. But there were only a few brooms that responded so quickly. Hermione's broom simply rolled over on the ground, and Neville's broom didn't budge at all. "Yvonne, is there some sort of trick to this?" Hermione asked, a little anxious as she watched more and more of the students successfully summon their brooms. "Hermione, speak softly, you've scared it," Yvonne said with a gentle smile. "And Neville, think of something that makes you really angry, and then yell at your broom," he added with a wink. These brooms were like living creatures, each with its own quirks. Hermione had been too firm from the start, and her repeated "up" had already startled her broom. Neville's side was even simpler. His broom saw the cowardice of its owner and ignored him. "Yvonne, humph." Hermione pouted in dissatisfaction when Yvonne said she was too fierce, but she still relaxed and called her broom in a gentle tone. Sure enough, just as Yvonne said, although the broom was not fast, it eventually flew into the hands of the little witch. Ah! It really did. Seeing this scene, Hermione was no longer suspicious. But Neville's face was changing colors. He looked like he would poop his pants at any moment. The poor kid was trying hard. He brewed his emotions, recalling Snape's sarcasm, that series of poisonous tongue, which was very lifelike. Up. But when Neville really got the broom, even the knowledgeable Mrs. Hooch was stunned. Chapter 57 Hooray! How did you do it? Madame Hooch looked at Yvonne, clearly intrigued. She thought for a moment and seemed to recognize the young wizard standing before her. "I remember you, you're Ambrosius." "It's me, Madame Hooch," Yvonne confirmed with a polite nod. "Ah, the professors have been talking about you," Madame Hooch said with a smile. "Because of your outstanding performance, Minerva's been in quite a good mood lately." How could she not be? Thanks to Yvonne, Professor McGonagall had been beaming with pride in front of the other professors. Lately, whenever Professor McGonagall encountered Yvonne, she couldn't help but have a smile on her face. By the way, how did you manage that just now? I mean, with those two brooms? Madame Hooch asked curiously. Well. Yvonne hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain it. The reason Yvonne could do it was thanks to his magic eye, which allowed him to see the magical fluctuations emanating from magical items. If magical items were like people, then Ivan's ability was akin to a special form of mind reading, allowing him to sense what these enchanted objects were thinking. During his time at Hogwarts, whenever Yvonne passed by magical paintings in the corridors, different emotional fluctuations would surface in his mind. From the entire castle itself to the memory ball Neville had just received, every magical creation carried the lingering spiritual essence of its creator. By interpreting those magical auras, Yvonne had developed an even deeper understanding of enchanted objects. This was the powerful talent Yvonne had come to fully grasp after his soul attribute had reached 5 points. Not only Madame Hooch, but the other young wizards were also baffled. The emotions of magic items? The castle has its own thoughts? These words sounded so abstract, like the fairy tales they'd heard as children. There was no other explanation, so everyone could only attribute it to Ivan's unique talent. Can't be learned. Ambrosius, the omnipotent, Malfoy muttered from not far away. He knows everything. Though his words were meant to be teasing, after hearing them, many of the students couldn't help but secretly nod in agreement. 1 month into the school year, Yvonne really did seem omnipotent. So far, they hadn't encountered anything Yvonne couldn't handle. And yet, he wasn't cold or arrogant. Yvonne always carefully explained the mistakes and key points to any young wizard who came to him for help with magic. He was always calm, elegant, and polite. Even a troublemaker like Malfoy held a mix of respect and fear for Yvonne. Yvonne is the prize of our house. Hermione was proud, and Neville nodded repeatedly. Yes, if you're in trouble, why not ask the amazing Ambrosius? Next, Madame Hooch demonstrated how to mount the broom without slipping off. She walked through the group, correcting their hand positions. During this time, Madame Hooch criticized Malfoy for holding the broom incorrectly more than once, causing Harry and Ron to stifle their laughter. All right, when I blow the whistle, you kick off from the ground hard, Madame Hooch instructed. Keep the broom steady, rise a few feet, then lean forward slightly and descend back to the ground vertically. Wait for my whistle. Before Madame Hooch could bring the whistle to her lips, Neville let out a startled scream. His feet had already left the ground, and suddenly, he shot up into the sky like a cork popping from a bottle. Come back, boy. Madame Hooch's face turned pale, but before she could react, Neville was already plummeting towards the ground at an alarming speed. Slow down. Recognizing the moment from the original book, Ivan's eyes narrowed. He flicked his wand, casting a quick freezing charm that enveloped the air around Neville. Yvonne didn't aim at Neville directly but instead froze the entire sky above the training ground, including Neville and his flying broom. Merlin's socks. Madame Hooch noticed this and, while relieved, she was also stunned by Ivan's spell-casting ability. What an incredible freezing charm! Are you all right, Neville? Yvonne gently pulled Neville down from the air, undoing the freezing charm on him. Neville was pale, clearly shaken by the experience. Hermione, Ron, and Harry rushed over to comfort him, while Yvonne checked his condition. It was obvious that Neville was just scared, not hurt. Are you okay, dear? Madame Hooch asked, concern in her voice. Do you need me to take you to the hospital wing? I am fine, ma'am. Neville responded timidly, still shaken but unwilling to leave in such a sorry state. I was just too nervous. Ivan's wand glowed softly as he cast a cheering charm on Neville, filling him with warmth and happiness, dispelling the remnants of his fear. Feeling better now? Yes, much better. Neville's face turned a little redder, amazed by the effect. Thank you, Yvonne, that spell is amazing. The cheering charm, Yvonne explained with a smile, also known as the happy charm, it's a simple spell to help lift someone's spirits. Yvonne reassured everyone not to worry about their flying troubles, promising that he would be ready to rescue them if anything went wrong, ensuring that no one would get hurt. With Ivan's assurance, the nervous students immediately felt a wave of relief. Good lad. Madame Hooch praised, visibly impressed. Gryffindor, 15 points for Mr. Ambrosius' outstanding behavior. Hooray! The Gryffindors erupted in cheers. Yvonne. 15 points. Yvonne. They shouted, jumping up and down in celebration, while the Slytherins on the other side looked on enviously. But as jealous as they were, even the Slytherins had to admit that Yvonne was on a different level. This guy didn't seem like a first year at all, he was too impressive. Yes, very good, keep it steady. Madame Hooch continued to instruct as the students began to lift off the ground. Don't look around, keep your balance, and trust your broom. Before long, under Madame Hooch's guidance and corrections, the young wizards were all flying in the air on their brooms. Yvonne hovered nearby, staying close to Hermione and Neville. The two were flying extremely low, almost skimming the ground, but considering both of them were nervous about heights, Yvonne stayed by their side to give them a sense of safety. Ah! Suddenly, a scream echoed from not far away. Yvonne looked over and saw a girl from Gryffindor, falling from the sky. Immobilis. Yvonne reacted quickly. Without even pulling out his wand, he froze the little witch in midair, preventing her from hitting the ground. Child, are you okay? Madame Hooch hurried over, checking the girl's condition with concern. The girl was Lavender Brown, a fellow Gryffindor. In the original story, she eventually had a relationship with Ronald and tragically died at the hands of the werewolf Fenrir Greyback. Besides that, Lavender and another girl, Parvati Patil, were Hermione's roommates. Particularly with Parvati, Hermione had developed a strong friendship. Whenever Yumi, Ivan's cat, visited, Parvati would shower the cat with snacks, earning her a lot of affection from the adorable Yumi. I'll take you to the school hospital, and the rest of you will follow Ambrosius' lead. Lavender wasn't physically injured, but the shock from falling had Madame Hooch worried. Luckily, Yvonne was there. After 2 successful rescues, along with the constant praise from Professors McGonagall, Flitwick, and Sprout, Madame Hooch had come to fully trust Ivan's reliability and excellence. Thank you, Yvonne, Madame Hooch added. Before I come back, just make sure no one flies over the wall. I understand, ma'am, Yvonne replied, nodding. He stopped actively flying and instead hovered leisurely on his broom, watching the others enjoy their flying lesson. Chapter 58 Potter vs Malfoy. Yvonne didn't have much personal interest in flying on brooms. It was relaxing enough to float around and observe others as they practiced. Interestingly, Yvonne wasn't particularly fascinated by real flying magic either, though he knew it had its merits. In the original story, only Snape and Voldemort were shown using that kind of magic. Yvonne suspected that Snape's flying abilities might have originated from the same source as Voldemort's, given how similar their styles of flight appeared. It looks like I'll have to find a way to learn this magic from Snape, Yvonne thought to himself. Though Yvonne already had ways to fly such as transforming into an obscurus and soaring through the sky in the form of a black storm, he knew that using this method would expose his identity as an obscurial. Yvonne was careful to avoid causing any unnecessary trouble, especially for Dumbledore, who had been incredibly kind to him. He was far from ungrateful and didn't want to put the old headmaster in a difficult position. Yvonne didn't doubt the integrity of the Hogwarts professors, but he was cautious of the reactions from the wider wizarding community. He remembered how poorly Harry had been treated after Voldemort's return in the original timeline. He wasn't about to let himself or his friends be exposed to similar dangers. The Ministry of Magic, the parents of the students, the board of directors. Yvonne was sure that once his identity as an obscurial was exposed, there would be no place for him at Hogwarts. Yvonne. Lost in thought, Yvonne suddenly heard Hermione calling his name, snapping him back to reality. What's wrong? How am I flying? Yvonne glanced at Hermione, who was floating a few feet off the ground. You're doing well. Keep it steady, just like that. Thanks to Ivan's guidance, both Hermione and Neville had managed to balance their brooms about 2 meters above the ground. Their progress hadn't gone unnoticed, and Hermione's roommate, Parvati, approached shyly, hoping to ask for some tips on flying. Of course, Yvonne wasn't going to refuse. Parvati was an Indian witch with delicate features and a warm smile. Unlike Hermione, who as a child was more focused on her studies than her appearance, Parvati had an air of elegance even at her young age. She was charming and had a natural sense of style. Yvonne recalled that in the original books, the Patil sisters Parvati and her twin Padma were considered some of the most beautiful girls at Hogwarts. Too bad they weren't portrayed as such in the movies, Yvonne thought to himself, remembering the casting decisions that hadn't quite captured the character's appeal. Thankfully, in this real world, the Patil sisters were just as striking as he had imagined. Whether it was Hermione, whose beauty was often hidden behind her bookish demeanor, or Parvati, both had a pleasing presence. Very good, you've all got a handle on flying, Yvonne said, standing on the grass while Hermione, Parvati, and Neville hovered above him. After some time practicing, they had managed to reach a height of about 3 meters, a big improvement from where they had started. "Yvonne, don't you want to practice too?" Hermione asked, feeling a little guilty that Yvonne had given up his own time flying to help them. Parvati and Neville seemed to share her thoughts. "Me?" Yvonne grinned, stepping onto his broom with a smooth motion. The next second, he shot into the sky like a gust of wind. Yvonne soared through the air like an arrow, performing several advanced moves he had read about in Hermione's Quidditch through the ages. His movements were fluid and controlled, and after a few more impressive maneuvers, he descended gracefully, landing right next to the trio. "Wow! Yvonne, have you been practicing in secret? I think Ivan's good enough to try out for the Quidditch team." Parvati chimed in, thoroughly impressed. The three were amazed by Ivan's flying skills. Hermione thought for a moment that maybe Yvonne had been secretly practicing, but then remembered that they spent nearly every day together. There simply hadn't been time for him to do that. As for Parvati, she was completely captivated by Ivan's graceful and heroic figure as he flew through the air, unable to shake the image from her mind. Quidditch, as a sport, might not hold much interest for Yvonne. But he had clearly underestimated its significance in the wizarding world. For many of the young wizards, like Parvati, Neville, Lavender, and others, Quidditch players were nothing short of the most dazzling celebrities in their eyes. Because of this, Ivan's impressive display of flying skills had drawn the excited cheers of all the young wizards, who now gazed at him with admiration and awe. "Is there anything he can't do?" Ron muttered, a hint of jealousy in his voice, while Harry watched Yvonne with admiration in his eyes. To Harry, it almost seemed as if Yvonne were the real savior, rather than himself. Seeing the group gathered around Yvonne, Malfoy's eyebrows shot up. Unwilling to let Yvonne steal all the attention, he sidled over to Harry and Ronald and began his usual routine of provoking Harry, or Scarhead, as he liked to call him. "Ah!" Suddenly, a scream echoed across the field. Everyone turned to look, and their eyes widened at the sight of two figures flying high into the sky, one chasing after the other. "What's going on?" Yvonne squinted, focusing his gaze. He quickly realized the two people were none other than Harry and Malfoy. Yvonne was a little confused. In the original story, Malfoy had taken Neville's Remembrall, which led to Harry's famous flying scene. But now Neville was standing there, and the Remembrall was safely in his pocket. What on earth happened between the two of them? The crowd parted as Yvonne walked up to Ron, who still seemed a bit dazed. Hermione was shouting at the two boys in the sky, "Come down quickly! You're flying too high, it's dangerous! Hey Weasley, what's gotten into them?" "It's Malfoy." Ronald quickly explained what had just transpired. "He insulted Harry's parents." Tisk. Yvonne quickly pieced the situation together. Malfoy must have mocked Harry with cruel words about his parents, and Harry, unable to hold back, probably tried to confront him. But instead of facing him, Malfoy arrogantly flew into the air, continuing his taunts from above. Good grief! Who could stand that? If you could tolerate that, you wouldn't be Harry Potter. Yvonne shook his head, feeling at a loss for words for both of them. "Let's get them down first, then I'll deal with Malfoy." With that thought in mind, Yvonne had already drawn his wand. But before Yvonne could cast a spell, Malfoy, high up in the sky, swerved and hit the top of a tower in the distance. He tumbled down, falling straight toward the ground. "Oh Merlin! He's falling!" The sight scared many of the young wizards present. Especially Pansy Parkinson, who screamed as her face turned pale. Without thinking, she sprinted toward where Malfoy was falling. "Yvonne!" Hermione called out anxiously. Ivan's eyes narrowed as his grip tightened around his wand, ready to cast a cushioning charm. "Hey!" However, the next moment, Ivan's hand paused mid-air. Harry, still airborne, suddenly dived with incredible speed and agility, catching Malfoy just in time. His movement was so quick and precise that it left everyone around in stunned silence. "Harry Potter! Potter!" Cheers erupted, with Seamus shouting the loudest, amazed at the sheer skill Harry had just displayed. "Did you see that? That was a fake move like Jaren. Harry just pulled off a flying skill that even professional players don't know." The young wizards were buzzing with excitement, astonished by Harry's impressive reflexes and flying ability. Yvonne, now lowering his wand, couldn't help but be impressed as well. "Is this what a 4-point reflex score looks like?" he mused to himself. "Incredible! Yvonne was a little surprised. He hadn't expected that, even with his presence, Harry would still show such extraordinary flying talent. Of course, Yvonne wasn't upset or jealous. To him, the kind and simple Harry was like a younger brother, helpless, often living in the shadows, with no real support. If anything, Yvonne didn't mind letting Harry have his moment in the spotlight, enjoying the cheers and attention that came with being the boy who lived. Well, we'll just have to work on this kid's impulsiveness, Yvonne thought, smiling as he joined everyone in welcoming Harry back, victorious. Yvonne, how's Malfoy? Harry asked, concern in his voice. He's fine, Yvonne replied. Using magic, Yvonne had gently laid Malfoy flat on the grass. After checking him over, he concluded that Malfoy was more frightened than hurt, no real injuries. But Malfoy's face was still as pale as a ghost. It wasn't the fall that embarrassed him, it was the fact that Harry Potter, the person he disliked most, had saved him. Harry Potter. After the flying class, Professor McGonagall came rushing over, calling Harry's name. Without explanation, she whisked Harry away, leaving Hermione and the others worried about what might happen. But Yvonne wasn't concerned. He knew exactly why Professor McGonagall had taken Harry away. She had seen his incredible flying talent and was likely about to invite him to join the Gryffindor Quidditch team as a seeker. Sure enough, at dinner, Harry shared this matter with everyone with great excitement. Chapter 59 Yvonne vs Snape. Are you kidding? Ron didn't even notice that his favorite beef pie slipped off his fork when he heard that Harry became a seeker. Harry, you must be the youngest seeker in all these years. Ron was very envious, but when he thought of Harry's excellent performance when he saved Malfoy, he could only hide that little bit of jealousy in his heart. Congratulations, Harry. Yvonne congratulated Harry from the bottom of his heart, and the boy said a little stiffly, Yvonne, your flying skills are also very good, I think you should also join. Harry. Yvonne interrupted Harry with a smile, and said, I'm not very interested in Quidditch. Don't look at me like that. At this point, the little wizards around looked sideways, thinking that it was too unbelievable that Yvonne didn't like Quidditch. That's Quidditch. There are people in this world who don't like Quidditch. To be honest, I prefer studying flying spells to Quidditch. Seamus questioned beside him, there is no spell in the wizarding world that can make people fly. I mean, to make yourself fly without relying on any props. Yes. Yvonne did not refute this point. He said, that's why it's worth studying, isn't it? Well, everyone had become accustomed to Ivan's erudition and fantastic ideas. I believe you will succeed. Although Harry liked Quidditch, he also admired Yvonne. After a month of getting along, Harry and Hermione had already become used to it. Yvonne is omnipotent. Why not ask the smart Yvonne? I have Yvonne, what do you have? Well, since Yvonne said so, it must not be aimless. In the days that followed, Yvonne and Hermione immersed themselves in learning magic. During this period, the buzz about Harry becoming a seeker lasted for several days. Malfoy provoked Harry over this. However, it seemed that Yvonne intervened, and the midnight duel that was supposed to take place did not happen, which meant Harry didn't mistakenly enter the restricted corridor on the 4th floor. Unconsciously, Yvonne had changed the original plot. The game of breaking through the trap of the Philosopher's Stone was, without anyone realizing it, moving farther and farther away from Harry. Time passed quickly, and Halloween was approaching. Are you kidding me? Hermione looked at Yvonne blankly, unable to believe her ears. You're going to duel Professor Snape. The two walked along the Black Lake, not far from where a giant squid lazily lay on the grass, basking in the sun. The giant squid was a well-known sight in the Black Lake at Hogwarts. Legend had it that it was Gryffindor's Animagus, the largest Animagus in the world. Yvonne didn't know how to respond to that. Under his magical eye and spiritual vision, this giant squid was certainly magical, but there was no indication it had transformed from Gryffindor. Besides, the giant squid had a good temper. Though it looked a bit like something out of a Thulhu myth, it often rescued young wizards who fell into the lake and was known to interact with couples who hung out by the lake, hence its popularity with Hogwarts students. Well, Yvonne replied as he walked alongside Hermione. He nodded. Do you want to come and watch? Yes, can I? Hermione asked, a little excited. She had thought that this private duel would be kept secret, but since Yvonne had invited her, how could she refuse? Snape was a professor at the school, the head of the Slytherin house. She knew Yvonne was incredibly talented and strong. But just 2 months after starting school, for him to duel with a professor? It completely shattered Hermione's understanding of what was possible. In Hermione's opinion, this was no different than a primary school student competing with a professor at a famous university. It's just a duel, it has nothing to do with magical knowledge, Yvonne explained calmly. Whether they won or lost, it would only prove the fighting abilities of both Yvonne and Snape. Magical knowledge wasn't necessarily the same as fighting ability. This is very dangerous, Hermione said worriedly. What if you get hurt? Don't worry. Headmaster Dumbledore will be there, Yvonne reassured her. The headmaster will be there too. Hermione's eyes widened. She wanted to complain a little. How could their lives as first-year students be so different? She had worked so hard to create the image of a perfect student in front of Professor McGonagall. And Yvonne? He was casually chatting and laughing with the headmaster and all the professors. Actually, this whole thing was arranged by Headmaster Dumbledore. Yvonne explained further. He wants to test my practical level, and also because I was asked to step in for Harry's situation. Must be about Harry's mother, right? Hermione hesitatingly thought. She didn't want to bother Yvonne with her questions but was clearly curious. Hermione's sense of inferiority made her feel like a little wizard like her wasn't worthy of watching a duel between Yvonne and Professor Snape. But won't it be a bit abrupt if I come? She asked hesitantly. It's fine, Yvonne reassured her with a smile. I've already mentioned it to Headmaster Dumbledore, and he agreed to let you come. Really? Hermione's eyes lit up at the mention of Dumbledore's approval. The chance to watch a professor's duel wasn't something an ordinary first-year student could experience. Hermione couldn't deny how excited she felt. Of course, Yvonne said. And when the time comes, I'll tell you a secret. A secret? Hermione tilted her head in curiosity, her bushy hair swirling slightly in the breeze. You'll find out soon enough, Yvonne replied with a mischievous smile. Yvonne planned to tell Hermione about his identity as an obscuralist, something he had been preparing for. Hermione was the person he trusted the most in this world, and he felt it was time. Over time, Hermione had grown under Ivan's influence. She wasn't as rigid and rule-abiding as she once was. While she still respected school rules, when it came to choosing between Yvonne and the rules, she wouldn't hesitate to side with him. For instance, when Yvonne broke school rules, Hermione would cover for him without hesitation. Even if Yvonne were to get into trouble and face expulsion, Hermione wished she could share the blame with him. In her mind, they were in it together through thick and thin. I'll cheer for you, Hermione said, a bit more boldly than usual. She subconsciously grabbed Ivan's hand but quickly let go, her cheeks flushing pink. Yvonne asked, pretending not to notice. What's wrong? Nothing, Hermione mumbled, feeling her face grow hotter. She wasn't sure why she felt so shy all of a sudden, so she quickly changed the subject. When's the duel? 8 o'clock tonight, at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. HN. After that, they didn't say much more, simply sitting quietly by the Black Lake, admiring the serene water and the view around them. Not far away, the giant squid noticed the pair. It lazily waved a tentacle, causing ripples to dance across the lake's surface. It seemed to sense the purity of the feelings shared between the young wizards, reminding it of times long past. Decades ago, there had been another pair of young wizards sitting by the Black Lake, just like them. Sadly, those two hadn't ended up together. That night, Yvonne brought Hermione to the headmaster's office. Ah, our genius Ambrosius, and look, he brings his girlfriend everywhere he goes, Snape sneered. He had been waiting there for a while, and when he saw Yvonne with Hermione trailing behind him, his irritation flared up. What? Do you want her to cheer you on during the duel? With a smirk, Snape added, since when did Miss Know-It-All also start moonlighting as someone's personal cheerleader? Hermione's fists clenched, her temper rising. She wanted to snap back, but after 2 months of enduring Snape's sharp tongue and prejudice, she was getting used to it. Professor, it was my idea to bring Hermione along, Yvonne said calmly. I thought witnessing a high-level magical duel would help broaden our understanding. High level? Snape scoffed, eyes narrowing in disbelief. From a young wizard who's barely been enrolled for 2 months. That, Yvonne replied, not backing down, depends entirely on you, Professor. I'm sure you wouldn't mind showing us what real high-level spellcasting looks like. Very arrogant today, are we, Mr. Ambrosius?" Snape hissed, feeling as though his authority had been challenged. He didn't believe for a second that Yvonne had the skills to truly compete with him. He was certain that Dumbledore must have lost his mind to suggest something so ridiculous. Young Yvonne. You are here. It seems you're ready," Dumbledore said as he entered the room, Fawkes perched elegantly on his shoulder. "Severus, don't underestimate Yvonne, or you might regret it." "Humph." Snape huffed. He knew Yvonne was talented, but he had no intention of going easy on him. Not tonight. Snape was determined to teach Yvonne a lesson, to remind him of the difference between their levels. He wanted the young wizard to understand what it meant to respect the hierarchy of skill and experience. "And Miss Granger, the brightest little witch in first grade," Dumbledore said, giving Hermione a playful wink. "I've heard nothing but praise from your professors." Headmaster, good evening," Hermione greeted politely, trying to keep her composure. "Good evening," Dumbledore responded warmly, his smile as gentle as ever. "I'm pleased to have you here to witness tonight's magical exchange. Seeing you reminds me so much of Minerva when she was your age." "Oh, why you're too kind," Hermione blushed, feeling honoured but slightly overwhelmed. She couldn't possibly compare herself to Professor McGonagall. In this world, the older Dumbledore was more like the calm and kind-hearted figure from the first two films, giving off a steady, comforting presence. Suddenly, Fawkes, Dumbledore's phoenix, fluttered off his shoulder and flew around gracefully. "Hold on tight." Dumbledore gestured for the three to grab hold of his arm. Just as they did, a burst of flame erupted from Fawkes, enveloping them all in a brilliant flash. Before Hermione could fully process what was happening, the world around them shifted. "Where are we?" Hermione asked in awe, glancing around at their new surroundings. "The Forbidden Forest?" "We're in the Forbidden Forest." This ability, like teleportation, was something Hermione, being well-read, could easily recognize. Fireplace Fleur network, apparition. But Hogwarts shouldn't allow apparition, right? "A little trick for an old man," Dumbledore said kindly as he stood with Hermione. "You'll keep my secret, won't you?" "Of course." Hermione quickly understood what this meant. The ability to apparate within Hogwarts was no small feat. As the two stood quietly watching, Yvonne and Snape moved to the edge of the Forbidden Forest, preparing for their duel. Dumbledore drew his old, powerful wand, the Elder Wand, and began to cast layer upon layer of protective spells around the area. Even though they were deep in the Forbidden Forest, far from the main grounds of Hogwarts, Dumbledore took no chances. He meticulously placed protective barriers to ensure that whatever transpired would not affect the other students back at the castle. Considering the magnitude of the magic Dumbledore cast, along with the power of the Elder Wand, the strength of the barriers was extraordinary. Even if Voldemort himself appeared, it would take considerable effort to break through. Surely, Dumbledore has lost his mind, setting up so much protection for a simple duel, Snape thought to himself, clearly annoyed. Snape glared at Dumbledore with irritation, not fully grasping why the headmaster was making such a big deal out of this duel. Just a little first year, what could possibly happen? Snape thought, but Dumbledore's playful wink only fueled his annoyance further. "All right, you two," Dumbledore finally said, his tone more serious. "According to dueling etiquette, you must first salute your opponent." Yvonne and Snape followed the instructions, raising their wands respectfully. But rather than turning back to back and stepping away like informal duels, they remained facing each other directly, tension thick in the air. Yvonne appeared focused, his expression composed. Snape, on the other hand, had a more casual, almost dismissive air about him. "Professor," Hermione whispered nervously, standing next to Dumbledore. "Who do you think will win?" Technically, it wasn't a question Hermione should have asked. After all, Snape was a seasoned professor, an expert in potions and the dark arts. Yvonne, despite his brilliance, had only been at Hogwarts for 2 months. Yet Hermione couldn't help but hope. Yvonne was capable of so much, she thought, maybe just maybe he could surprise them all once again. It's hard to say. Dumbledore guessed the purpose of Yvonne asking Hermione to come here. Yvonne was going to get serious. "What?" Hermione was surprised. "You mean Yvonne has a chance of winning?" "Yes." Dumbledore didn't dodge the question and said directly, "Little Ivan's strength, at least in terms of dueling, is quite impressive. Let's begin." Snape started with a disarming charm. The red light cut through the darkness, heading straight for Ivan's chest. The speed was so fast that even Hermione, watching from the side, didn't have time to react. Such a fast spell! But Ivan simply sidestepped the spell with a smooth motion. Then, he countered with his own disarming charm while casually waving his empty left hand. Humph! To Snape, Ivan's disarming charm seemed clumsy. The speed and angle looked like that of a beginner. But just as Snape was about to block it with a shield charm, a strange sense of foreboding suddenly welled up inside him. Danger! Without any hesitation, Snape chose to follow his instinct. He also dodged this disarming spell. At the same time, a huge rock beside him seemed to be pulled and rolled towards him. Chapter 60 You Must Be Sweating. Gesture Casting. Snape was shocked. He didn't expect Ivan to master the technique of nonverbal casting with gestures. How old is he? Boom! Before Snape could think further, a loud noise from behind interrupted his thoughts. Snape didn't know what had just happened behind him. Now wasn't the time to dwell on it. Disapparate! With a sharp crack, Snape's figure vanished. The flying debris from the boulder missed, and Snape reappeared in an open space not far away. What did you do? Snape's face turned serious. He glanced back at where he had been standing and saw that the area, once full of bushes, had turned into a mess of rubble. You! Snape stared at the spot in shock and then back at Ivan with horror in his eyes. Your disarming spell! What kind of exaggerated destructive power is this? This kid! Are you sure that what you just cast was a disarming spell and not a blasting curse? Even if it was a blasting curse, isn't that power a bit too much? Professor! Ivan remained calm, raising his wand lightly. I think it's better for you to experience it for yourself. Boom! With those words, another red disarming spell shot toward Snape. This time, Snape didn't dodge. Instead, he cast his own disarming spell. Bang! In an instant, two red beams collided mid-air, the dazzling light and the clash of magic sending sparks flying. This! Snape's pupils shrank slightly. Almost the moment the spells collided, he felt an overwhelming sense of pressure. Heavy, surging, and unstoppable. How is this kid's magic so strong? The power of magic wasn't just in its destructive force, but in something more like a fundamental shift in quality. In a duel like this, the magic of both participants connects through their spells, and it becomes a pure contest of magical strength. And now, in this duel, the professor is being overpowered by Ivan. Hermione's eyes widened, trembling slightly. In her sight, the night was lit by the red light of their spells clashing. What was even more astonishing was that the point of collision, which should have stayed between the two duelers, was now shifting rapidly toward Snape. Is this Ivan's strength? Hermione couldn't believe what she was witnessing. She knew Ivan was powerful, but this powerful? Damn it! Snape finally understood what Dumbledore meant by it's hard to judge the outcome. This kid is a freak. How can he have such strong magic at his age? Huffing slightly, Snape quickly severed the magical connection between them. With a wave of his wand, the trees around them seemed to spring to life. The branches twisted wildly, and the roots surged up from the ground. What is this? Hermione had never seen such magic before, but she quickly tried to analyze it. Is this Transfiguration? Can Transfiguration really be this advanced? Never underestimate our Hogwarts professors, Miss Granger. Dumbledore, not using the Elder Wand, casually created a circular barrier around himself and Hermione, unaffected by the chaotic forest in front of them. Amazing Transfiguration! Ivan couldn't help but admire Snape's skill. He had always thought Professor McGonagall was the undisputed master of Transfiguration at Hogwarts. But Snape wasn't weak either. Though there was still some distance between him and McGonagall, Snape's abilities were impressive, showing the qualities of a master in his own right. Incendio! Ivan knew he couldn't match Snape in Transfiguration, so he opted for a different approach. He pointed his wand forward, and a torrent of flames erupted out of thin air, quickly spreading like a wildfire. Endless flames surrounded Ivan, as if they had a life of their own, burning through all the roots and vines that tried to close in on him. Foolish! Snape silently criticized Ivan's approach. His roots and vines were still trees at their core, only altered in form. Using fire to burn them would only lead to Ivan being trapped in the flames himself. Experience gap? Ivan furrowed his brow slightly as smoke began to swirl around him. He quickly realized the flaw in using fire against trees. Foolish mistake. Ivan's eyes narrowed slightly. I'll learn from this. Every failure is a learning experience. And every fight earns wisdom. Fiend fire. With a sharp wave of his wand, the raging flames spread out in all directions, forming a ring of fire in the shape of a massive fist. In the middle of the scorched battlefield, Ivan and Snape stood facing each other. This spell. Snape's expression twitched in disbelief. He felt like his entire understanding of the magical world was being shaken by this young wizard. You can actually use this spell. How is this even possible? Snape knew how difficult Fiend Fire was, not because it was an overly complex spell, but because it demanded an enormous amount of magical power. If Snape's magical power were to be quantified, it would be at the peak of 3 points, bordering on 4. The 4-point mark is a significant threshold in magical attributes. To break through 4 points, unless you are part of a rare bloodline, like the Dumbledores with their Phoenix ancestry, you'd have to rely on something like magical transformation. But magical transformation is incredibly dangerous. It's no exaggeration to say that wizards attempting it are risking death. In terms of talent alone, Snape is no less gifted than Voldemort was at his age. The key difference is Voldemort's daring. He underwent magical transformations multiple times, splitting his soul through Horcruxes, sacrificing his sanity for more magical power, ultimately breaking through into the realm of a great wizard. But, considering their ages, Snape is still young. He's only 32 years old. Given another 40 years, it's possible Snape could reach Voldemort's heights. And don't forget, Snape's specialty is potions, and the critical step in magical transformation is crafting the right potion. Since the day we decided to duel, I've been working on a spell. I haven't managed to cast it perfectly till now, but Professor, now's not the time for reflection, Ivan said calmly. He raised his wand to the sky and drew an arc. The flames surged but seemed to take on life. Under Ivan's command, they transformed into a colossal firebird, tens of meters tall, soaring with a fierce energy. The spell Vulcan Opening the Way isn't just about pushing flames aside. As a spell that requires 4 points of magical power, Vulcan Opening the Way allows the caster to fully control any flame, except Fiend Fire. But, if the Fiend Fire is cast by the same wizard, Vulcan Opening the Way can even help manage it, making the dangerous fire easier to control. This is Ivan's power. Hermione gazed at the firebird formed by Ivan's summoned flames, her body trembling slightly. Excitement, awe, and happiness washed over her. But more than that, there was a deep sense of witnessing something legendary. Is my friend really this strong? At that moment, Hermione's admiration for Ivan peaked. He was the only person she could focus on. Huff, Professor, show your true power, Ivan said calmly. Otherwise. His silver eyes glinted faintly as he waved his wand, causing the ground beneath them to rumble. The earth and rocks, previously disturbed by the tree roots, began to gather, and within moments, a towering stone giant, 7 or 8 meters tall, stood in front of Ivan. You'll get hurt. As soon as Ivan finished speaking, the stone giant raised its fist, crashing down toward Snape with the force of a falling sky and collapsing earth. Pa! Snape activated apparition again, narrowly escaping the stone giant's attack with a grim expression. What's wrong with this kid? There was no doubt that the stone giant was a product of Transfiguration. Although it was somewhat crude, it was certainly more impressive than just levitating stones or bricks. The beauty of Transfiguration is that it has no fixed limit. The form it takes depends on the caster's magical power. But the issue here was the sheer size of that stone giant. How strong is his magic power? Is this kid really a little wizard? Snape had already sensed something unusual when Ivan cast Fiend Fire and Vulcan Opening the Way, but seeing him casually create a 3-story stone giant was enough to make Snape feel like his understanding of magic was being shattered. Waste of magic, Snape muttered disdainfully, though even Hermione could detect a note of bitterness in his tone. Before Hermione could say anything in response, the stone giant standing before Ivan was suddenly sliced cleanly in half. Swoosh! Thud! Through the flickering flames, she could clearly see the smoothness of the cut. Hey! Ivan frowned slightly. What just happened? Danger! A sudden sense of danger jolted Ivan, and he instinctively shifted to the side. However, though Ivan dodged, the old tree behind him was also split cleanly in half. What happened? Hermione's eyes widened, utterly confused. She had no idea what had just occurred. Why had the stone giant been sliced in two? Why had the tree behind Yvonne been similarly cleaved? Yvonne, could it be? Sectum Sempra. This strange scene reminded Yvonne of the dark magic created by Snape when he was a student, mentioned in the original series. The spell was invisible, had no form, but was devastatingly sharp. What powerful dark magic! Yvonne couldn't help but marvel at Snape's genius again. Unlike himself, Snape had created such magic through sheer talent and intellect without a golden finger system or any external aids. You dodged. Snape's surprise was evident. Just moments ago, his intent had been to sever Ivan's hand. Sectum Sempra had a counter curse, so even if Ivan's hand had been cut off, it could be reattached without much trouble. Still, it wasn't a spell for the faint of heart. If this kid can't even handle a little pain, then there's nothing more to say. Snape thought to himself. It seems I've earned your acknowledgement, Professor, Yvonne said calmly. Yvonne, how could I not be honored when you use such dangerous dark magic on me, Professor? Are you scared? Snape sneered. Yvonne smiled. On the contrary, I'm quite pleased. Because this shows you no longer see me as some little wizard who needs to be handled with care. Now, you see me as a wizard of equal standing. Equal standing. Snape let out a harsh laugh, feeling mocked. A mere student, no matter how talented, what does that amount to? He would teach Yvonne a lesson. No matter how gifted you are, you're still just a boy in his eyes. The magic you just used is indeed dangerous, Yvonne noted, carefully observing the magic aura around him. The greatest advantage of Sectum Sempra, its invisibility, was nullified by his ability to see the magical signatures. He could predict its trajectory and dodge the lethal cuts. Time to take proper precautions, Yvonne murmured. The ground shook once more, but this time, even the trees surrounding them, along with their underground roots, began to churn and rise as if the earth itself had come alive. Ga la la! The sound of rocks shifting filled the air. The stone giant, which had been sliced in half by Snape, rapidly reassembled itself, while even more stone giants and tree-like creatures began to rise from the ground. They were towering and imposing, closing in on Snape from all sides. What in Merlin's beard? Snape muttered, suddenly regretting the duel. What kind of absurd magical ability is this? At a glance, there were at least 5 giant constructs, all fully formed and menacing. For Snape, controlling just 2 of these would be challenging. But Yvonne? 5 of them, and it didn't even seem like he was close to his limit. Well, I think this should do for now, Yvonne said, waving his hand as all 5 giants lunged toward Snape. After all, you're a professor, so it's only fair I even the odds 5 against 1. Don't hold it against me.
Thanks for listening.